Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is prints of the audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31, The Howling. Malum datum, 405.m34. It would be called The Howling. Later, when the dust had settled and the dead had been tallied, the Imperial scholars tasked with writing the secret histories reserved for the eyes of the Imperium's highest authorities would use that name. They would not know that it was also the name used by the lost and the damned, if for different reasons. At the time, however, there was no naming it. No one understood what was happening, except for Sanguinius, who stood at the root of it all, his brothers, damned and loyal alike, and a handful of other beings, such as Eldrad Ulthran. When the angel struck down the Cacodóminus, last of its ancient alien breed, its final act was to unleash its full power upon the galaxy in a single psychic death scream. The Catalexis system itself suffered the worst from the howling. All life on Catalexis Secundus was wiped out, while the site of the Cacodóminus demise was torn asunder, creating a permanent warp rift that spread madness and unreality across the entire world. Sanguinius himself vanished into the rift, his disappearance felt by every blood angel still aboard the fleet. Something that resembled a river as imagined by a mind that had only ever heard of the idea of liquid flowed from that rift, twisting the land into impossible shapes, atop which still clung the remnants of the Cyclopean cities built by the Xenos slaves. The corpses that covered the world became materials for things that crawled out of the river. These entities could technically be considered daemons, but they had not been created by any of the ruinous powers, instead spawning from the Cacodóminus' own tormented thoughts and emotions. The Imperial commanders left in orbit, where they had directed the ongoing battle against the Cacodóminus fleet, found themselves suddenly alone. The enemy ships had fallen silent, their crews collapsed at their stations. The wards that had been carved into the hulls of the Imperial ships to protect them from the Cacodóminus domination had shielded them from the worst of the howling, though those ships whose wards had been damaged in battle before were now as dead as those of the Cacodóminus slaves. The navigators had survived, but every astropath in the fleet was dead, as were most of the sanctioned psychers who had accompanied the crusade. Re-establishing communication and order took several days, and would have taken much longer if not for the swift and decisive action of a group of inquisitors and blood angels who had put aside their distrust and grown somewhat close during the crusade. With no way to contact the rest of the Imperium, the leaders of the crusade could not know the full scope of the howling, but they suspected that its repercussions would be galactic in scale. Once the immediate aftermath of the battle had been dealt with, it was quickly decided to return to Imperial territory at speed. But the Blood Angels, refusing to believe that their Primarch was dead, a belief which was shared by most of the crusade, if only for moral purposes, didn't want to leave Catalexis. In truth, many of them had to be prevented from following him by plunging into the warp rift, such was their loyalty and dedication to the Angel. To appease these distraught warriors, it was decided that they would remain behind in Catalexis, tasked with enforcing an ultima-grade inquisitorial quarantine and to keep watch over the warp rift in case Sanguinius ever returned through it. 7 of us went down. I alone managed to make it out. There are monsters down there. They took Delilah by the throat and ran off with her. By the time we found her, we gave her the Emperor's piece. It was all we could do, even if Vlad had to die to rescue her. Our orders were to investigate the portal at the north, and so that's where we went. Our compasses and auspexes had stopped working the moment our gunship had entered the atmosphere, but we could all see the lights. Navigating the ruins was not easy. We lost Nira to a collapsing bridge, which folded upon itself into a single point before unfolding back again, with no trace of the tech priestess. Grieg disappeared while we passed through what looked like an administratum building, a door slammed close with him on the other side, and the room was empty, and different, when we opened it again. We saw the river, flowing from the tomb of the great monster. Dominic stared at it for too long, and threw himself into it. I can still hear the sound his soul made when it hit, and no, that's not hyperbole. I am still hearing it, even now. The sound of a soul being broken apart by the current of a god's grief. The angel is not there. That much I know. Wherever he is now, he is beyond Catalexis. But we did see some of his sons, or what were once his sons. They killed Nikolai, or at least, I hope they killed him. He certainly screamed loud enough. Catalexis isn't a world anymore. It's the nightmare of a dead god. Only our eyes give it the aspect of a planet, because we cannot conceive of its true nature. It has changed in ways we cannot understand, and it changes all those who come to it. I know what awaits me, even if I made it out. I saw it in the river, just before Dominic threw himself in it and shattered the image with his dissolved essence. I am not afraid. Extract from an investigation team dispatched to the surface of Catalexis Secundus as part of the investigation of the Howling by His Imperial Majesty's Most Sacred Inquisition. The interrogated acolyte later disappeared in his cell, despite being under constant surveillance while his fate was being decided. Efforts to locate him are still ongoing. On their way back home, the forces of the Crusade discovered that the other planets of the Catalexis system were graveyards, as was the rest of the Cacodominus' short-lived empire. The Howling had not simply left the slaves of the Xenos overlord empty-minded, it had killed them by the billions, in an act of genocide that even the Horus heresy would struggle to match in speed and efficiency. Eventually, the Crusade fleet reached an Imperial world, and learned what the Howling had wrought upon the galaxy. It had echoed through the warp from the furthest fringes of the galaxy to Holy Terra itself, blanketing the light of the Astronomicon and the laughter of the dark gods for a moment. Billions of astropaths and psychers perished, their minds obliterated. Millions of ships in transit through the warp were forever lost, thrown off course or consumed by swarms of ravenous daemons as their Geller fields failed. The economy of the Imperium, ever a tenuous thing due to the immense distances involved in any true galactic empire, collapsed virtually overnight. Even the prosperous kingdom of Ultramar, ruled over by Robert Guilliman for over 3,000 years, suffered from this calamity. Famine and anarchy spread to thousands of worlds, while the Adeptus Terra was powerless, unable to send its commands with the ranks of its astropaths all but annihilated. In the years that followed the Howling, even gathering enough psychers for the black ships to keep the Golden Throne going was difficult. Many craft worlds suffered greatly from the Howling, their psychically sensitive population seemingly targeted by the ancient Xenos' dying curse. The Wraithbone composing their world ships cracked and corroded, forcing the Eldars even deeper into hiding while they desperately worked to repair their spacefaring homes. Even the brutish orcs seemed cowed, with their primitive shamans interpreting the Howling as Gork, or perhaps Mork, screaming in pain, for reasons varying from breaking a teeth to having stubbed their toe. As psychers succumbed to the Howling, scores of demonic incursions occurred simultaneously across the Imperium. Mind-blasted psychers became gateways through which the raw power of the Empyrean could manifest. These infernal invasions were not directed by any of the ruinous powers, nor by any of their followers among the traitor legions. To Horus, this blatant display of the warp's true perils was actually a considerable setback. The Prince of the Eye had spent the last 2,000 years preying upon the enforced ignorance of Imperial citizens, seeking to turn their faith away from the Golden Throne and toward the poisonous Horusian philosophies. Now, even with the Inquisition's efforts to suppress the truth, evidence of the real nature of chaos was bound to spread among the Imperial elite, making them much more reluctant to throw off the shackles of Imperial oppression if this was what awaited them. Other traitor legions were far more willing to take advantage of these circumstances. With the light of the Astronomicon fading, entire warbands of World Eaters departed the front lines of the Radiant Crusade in the Eye of Terror and sailed the etheric currents. While many were lost to the warp, thousands of berserkers emerged amidst Kyrnate incursions, fighting alongside the daemons of the Blood God and reaping harvests of billions of skulls. These warbands eventually coalesced into a slaughter tide under the leadership of one of the 8 warlords Horus had once appointed as leaders of the 12th Legion, Baar Zul. Warriors of the Emperor's children, seeking to partake of the banquet of carnage on offer, also left the Eye in unprecedented numbers. Without anyone in overarching command, these sons of Fulgrim simply rampaged on Imperial worlds already suffering from slaanishy demonic incursions. Though the 8th Legion had been reunited under the command of Conrad Kurz after the Darkness War and was formally allied to the Prince of the Eye, its more corrupt elements seized the opportunities presented by the Howling. Members of the former Dreadlord faction called upon the powers of chaos to manifest on daemon-haunted worlds, feasting on the terror of Imperial citizens and driving them to commit terrible sins in fear and desperation. Eager to make up for the losses of damned souls caused by the Cacodominus disturbance, the leadership of the Night Lords encouraged these actions, bending the infrastructure of Curlasium to provide the Ockerly needed to fuel the portal-opening rituals. On Sicarius, the Dark Council decided that the Howling was a sign of the Pantheon. Orders were sent to the agents cultivated by the 17th Legion. All over the Imperium, powerful magi drew upon the eldritch energies unleashed by the Howling to tear reality asunder, opening immense warp gates through which entire war hosts of the Word-bearers could cross. Thousands of Chaos Marines were dispatched, tasked with the destruction of Imperial holy sites whose existence was seen as an affront to the primordial truth by the Dark Apostles. Hidden in the webway, the Dark Eldar had escaped the Howling virtually unscathed, with only a few raiding parties that were in real space at the moment of the Cacodominus demise lost. As the Imperium slid into darkness, the lords and ladies of Commeric were quick to take advantage. Long forced to prudence while planning their raids by the watchful eyes of the White Scars, they dispatched forces to scores of worlds, abducting billions, and dragging them to the Dark City, there to be subjected to unspeakable fates to fuel that nightmare realm's endless thirst for suffering. On the fortress world of Kadaya, Rogaldorn witnessed all these events, and turned his gaze upon the Eye of Terror. Surely, thought the Praetorian, now would be the time for the hordes of chaos to attack. Not only was the Imperium thrown into disarray, Sanguinius himself, the only Primarch who could hope to match Horus in combat, was missing. Yet no such attack came. In the Eye of Terror, Horus was too busy hunting down the conspirators responsible for the Cacodominus awakening and the howling that came from it. His plans had been ruined, and would need to be remade from scratch. The Prince of the Eye still believed that he could ultimately turn the howling to his advantage, but he would not forgive such interference in his grand design. Even as other traitor legions preyed upon the weakened Imperium with renewed fervor, the War Master of Chaos focused all his attention on the Eye of Terror. Mighty war fleets departed from Melum, their course charted by Horus. As the rivals of the Horusians braced for attack, these forces completely ignored them, instead striking with overwhelming strength at seemingly insignificant targets, minor outposts and abandoned mining operations, temples to chaos that had been destroyed by summoned daemons, and other backwaters. Yet in truth, these locales were Alpha Legion strongholds, where the ever-elusive 20th had set up bases of operations. Scores of such outposts were destroyed by Horus envoys, with captured Alpha Legionaries being dragged in chains to Melum, there to be interrogated by the War Master himself. With the assistance of Ahriman, who had plucked the knowledge from daemons that had previously been summoned on Sorcerias while Antiochos made his report to the Crimson King, Horus had learned that the Alpha Legion had been involved in the unearthing of the Cacodominus. Now Horus wanted to know the motive behind such an act, but the divided nature of the Hydra made it difficult for him to capture a son of Alpharius who had actually been involved in the plot. Eventually, as the hunt for answers seemed to approach a point where it might reignite the Legion Wars, answers came to Melum on their own. A single mortal showed at the gates of Lupercalia and asked to be taken to Horus. Normally, such an arrogant mortal would have been either laughed at or executed for their insolence, but this was no mere Horusian pilgrim, this was Mariana, whose declaration had sundered the Crimson Accords at the end of the Legion's wars. Somehow, the ancient prophetess had returned to Melum undetected. The sons of Horus hastily brought her to their sire, who asked her why she had come. Mariana revealed that it was she who had orchestrated the awakening of the Cacodominus, with assistance from the Alpha Legion. She had foreseen that the alien godling would eventually be discovered, but that such a thing would occur centuries from now, in a time when both the Imperium and the traitor legions were too weakened from fighting each other to oppose it. In order to prevent the Cacodominus from enslaving the galaxy, a fate none of the powers competing for its control wished for, she had arranged for the archaeological expedition that had unearthed it. When he learned this, Horus' fury was great. No matter Mariana's reasons, that she had dared to interfere with his plans was not something the prideful Prince of the Eye could forgive. In a voice cold as the abyss between stars, he asked the witch why she had come before him, knowing what punishment would surely befall her for her transgression. Mariana smiled. There were not many who could have done this while faced with the wrath of Horus, even his brothers would hesitate when confronted with such a dreadful sight. "You will do as you must, Great One," she said softly, and then the sorcery ran out, and a doll of carved bone and wood fell on the floor. Horus' furious roar echoed all over Melum, before brutally ending as the Prince of the Eye stumbled, hand to his side, blood dripping between his fingers. Outside the Eye of Terror, it seemed for a time as if the Imperium would collapse, crushed under its own weight while bled to death by 1,000 cuts. But as humanity had proven before, it was a resilient species. Slowly, contact was re-established between Holy Terra and distant worlds. The Space Marine legions restored order and rallied scattered armies and fleets. The slaughter tide of Baarzul was broken at the Battle of Nine Suns, the Chaos Lord of the Eight slain in single combat by a champion of the Iron Hands. The hosts of the Word-Bearers were challenged by chapters of Ultramarines, with Guilliman himself leading them out of Ultramar. Unable to resist the opportunity to face their old foes once more, the sons of Lorgar fell for Guilliman's traps and were defeated. Yet even in victory, the Imperium could not catch every Chaos Marine that had taken advantage of the Howling to escape the Eye of Terror. Hundreds of renegade legionaries vanished in the galaxy's shadows. Many of them quickly formed new networks of cults, using these to make contact with their legions back in the Eye and plan the next stage of the Long War. The time of anarchy that followed the Howling was later marked into the Imperial histories as having finally ended in 505.M34. Then, 100 years after the destruction of the Cacodóminus, almost to the day, Sanguinius reappeared. The Great Angel was found on Baal, his legion's home world, wounded and exhausted, but alive. He would not speak of what had happened to him after the death of the alien overlord, even to the imperial dignitaries and legion envoys that flocked to his bedside while he recovered. All he said, before departing Baal and vanishing once more on his errant quest across the Imperium, was an order to send a message to his brother Guilliman in the Galactic East. The contents of that message would only ever be known to the Angel and the Avenging Sun. Chapter 32, The Fall of Empty Night. Malum Datum, 405.M34. Though the Imperium was badly wounded by the Howling, the consequences of the Cacodóminus demise were not limited to humanity's domain. Some were immediate, such as the damage suffered by the craft worlds of the Asuriani, and the demonic incursions that overwhelmed scores of Xenos worlds as their psychers succumbed to the Howling. But others would be far more sinister, and far more obscure. Far to the galactic east, in the cursed and abandoned region known as the Ghoul Stars, a antediluvian Xenos race had slumbered for eons. Its existence was recorded only in the most ancient legends of the Eldars, whose ancestors had fought against them a war that had shaken the very foundations of reality and given birth to the primordial annihilator, over 60 million years ago. They were the Necrons, who had abandoned their frail, sick bodies of flesh for eternal bodies of living metal at the suggestion of the star gods, the C'tan, only to realize that the star gods had deceived them and feasted upon their souls during the process of biotransference, leaving the immense majority of the former Necrontyr as little more than mindless automatons directed by their noble caste, which had retained their minds but lost their souls all the same. Following the end of the war in heaven, the Necrons had risen against the C'tan, led by their silent king, and broken the power of the victorious star gods. The C'tan had been sundered into shards, which had been imprisoned within tesseract labyrinths and vaults, their energies drained to fuel the great engines of the Necron dynasties. Yet the war in heaven and the rebellion against the C'tan had left the might of the Necron Empire spent, and so the Silent King had ordered his people into the Great Sleep, a slumber of eons, during which their remaining enemies would succumb to entropy, leaving the galaxy ripe for reconquest when the dynasties awakened once more. The Larkorak dynasty was one of the greatest of the Necron Empire, and its worlds rested in the Ghoul Stars, left mostly intact by the passing of geological epochs. Within immense crypts, billions of Necron warriors slumbered, while the nobles of the dynasty rested in ornate sarcophagi and the Canopitech machines and artificial intelligences of the Cryptex maintained the tomb worlds, protecting them from entropy and intruders. Great planetoid-sized engines and vast flotillas of tomb ships, which had last been used against the fleets of the Old Ones and their thralls, hung in the infinite void between stars, protected from detection by powerful dimensional veils. Many slumbering Necron dynasties had been ravaged by the Great Sleep, their tomb worlds destroyed by cosmic events or their maintenance systems succumbing to entropy. The Larkorak dynasty, by contrast, had escaped the ravages of deep time relatively unscathed. But when the Howling shook the galaxy, entropy's revenge was terrible. On the crown world of the Larkorak, where their Phaeron and his court slept within the dynasty's most secure crypts, the death cry of the Cacodóminus echoed across quantum frequencies that had been silent since the end of the war in heaven. Deep beneath the catacombs laid the great Tesseract vaults, where were imprisoned the C'tan shards entrusted to the Larkorak dynasty after the great rebellion against the star gods. Greatest and most dangerous of these shards was a fragment of Ozagorod, the Nightbringer, who had strained against its bonds ever since its defeat. These bonds were strong, but not even the technology of the Necrons was proof against the passage of deep time, and the shard of the Nightbringer had ever so slightly weakened them over the ages. It would have taken billions of years for the shard to break free of its own, something it was bitterly aware of, but such was its hatred of the Necrons who had betrayed it that it continued its efforts regardless of their perceived futility. When the Howling reached the Crown World, those tiny faults became the doom of the dynasty. The bonds of the Tesseract Vault shattered, and the C'tan shard was unleashed in the middle of the Larkoraka's greatest tomb world. Unwilling to risk being returned to its prison, the Nightbringer shard immediately turned on the other fragments of the star gods that had been imprisoned alongside it, dragging them out of the Tesseract labyrinths, serving as their own prisons only to then devour them and increase its own power. Once this echo of the great cannibalistic feasts which had marked the end of the war in heaven among the C'tan as they turned against each other before the Silent King even launched his rebellion was over, the power of the Nightbringer shard had swelled to the point that it had become that which the Necron cryptex fearfully referred to as a transcendent C'tan. Though still only a pale shadow of the star god's power at its apex, the Nightbringer had become a figure worthy of the name of God, and its revenge was only beginning. The Silent King, architect of the great Necron betrayal, was beyond its reach at the moment, but the Larkorak weren't. The defenses of the dynasty had protected the Faerun and his nobles for millions of years, but they were of little use against a transcendent C'tan already inside. Within days of its liberation, the Nightbringer had usurped control of the artificial intelligence managing the tomb complex, its divine power more than a match for even the strongest cryptech encryption. Emergency protocols forcefully awakened a small group of cryptechs and a single overlord and his personal legions, but their efforts to return the awakened god to its prison were met with abject failure. After amusing itself with destroying and rebuilding them again and again until their minds had completely collapsed, the C'tan simply wiped out their personalities, transforming them into enslaved automatas, little different to the billions of Necron warriors who slumbered in the lesser crypts of the Crown World. The next targets of the transcendent C'tan Zyre were the Faerun himself and his court. The Nightbringer didn't even give them the chance to realize their doom, instead wiping out their personality engrams before awakening their bodies of necrodermis as its servants. The highest nobles of the Larkorak dynasty were wiped out, reduced to puppets of a vengeful god, and the awakening of the entire Crown World began shortly after. Thankfully for the galaxy, the process of awakening a tomb world from the Great Sleep was a long and complex one, even with a transcendent C'tan at the helm and no care at all given to preserving the personality engrams of the Necrons. It took years before the Crown World was fully functional, during which the Nightbringer traveled to the other tomb worlds of the Larkorak in the Ghoul Stars and conquered them as well, wiping out the minds of their nobles and beginning the process of awakening. Slowly, over the course of decades, an entire major Necron dynasty was awakened, enslaved once more to the dark will of a fragment of the star god whose evil had been inscribed unto reality itself. At the command of Ozagorod, millions of Necron warriors were transformed into destroyers, their bodies remade into forms more suitable for the extermination of all life. The transcendent C'tan took particular delight in visiting this ignoble fate upon the nobles of the dynasty, defiling their artfully crafted and enhanced bodies by twisting them into cruel parodies of their former grandeur. It scoured away the markings of the dynasty, removing all traces of its sigil from their creations. The slumbering fleets were awakened as well, great flights of scythe-shaped crafts that mustered in orbit above the Crown World, piloted by dead-minded lords. These, the Nightbringer had left with a flicker of awareness, just enough to serve it well in their appointed task, and perhaps enough to scream at their renewed slavery to the star god. It was similar to the fate it had inflicted upon the Larkorak cryptex, who retained all of their skills in the Necron's techno-sorcery, though they were now driven by the same all-consuming appetite for destruction as their loathsome deity. Arsenals that had slumbered since the darkest days of the war in heaven were roused. The world engines were activated, their activation passphrase extracted from the memory banks of the Faerun. Meanwhile, the Nightbringer fed as its slaves labored, leeching off the energy of the Ghoul Stars, but in its diminished state, and clad in necrodermis as it was, its feeding was dramatically inefficient. Entire stars had their lifespans halved, billions of years of nuclear fusion drained away, for less than a millionth of the corresponding energy to settle in the transcendent C'tan's hungering maw. But the Nightbringer cared not. This rampant feeding, and the masquerade awakening of the Larkorak, did not go unnoticed by those who kept watch over the Eternal. The Praetorians of the Triarch, These elite Necron warriors and enforcers of the race's ruling council who had remained awake during the Great Sleep, had their own ways of monitoring the dynasties, and despite the caution of the Nightbringer Shard, they eventually realized something had gone horribly wrong. At the same time, the seers of Craftworld Aletok, which of all the Asuriani remembered the most of the lore the Ildari of old had accumulated on their ancient foe, sensed a terrible, empty darkness rising in the galactic east. Parties of rangers were sent to investigate, as this was happening far from the Craftworld's usual roaming regions in what the humans called Segmentum Obscurus, while the rest of Aletok prepared for war. Neither the envoys of the Praetorians nor the rangers of Aletok returned from their investigations, and all the while the visions of doom and the disturbances in the stellar patterns grew worse and worse. Until, 100 years after the Howling, but a few days after Robert Gilliman received a message from his brother Sanguinius recently returned from the warp after his confrontation with the Cacodominus, the Nightbringer decided that it was ready to begin its great harvest. Once more, the Star God would feed upon the souls of the living. Once more, it would lead the silent legions of the Necrons against the races of the galaxy, bringing terror and desolation to all. It would reclaim the power that it had once possessed and more, for it couldn't sense any of its kindred at work in the galaxy, and the Immaterium-spawned entities the mortal races called gods were powerless against it. So began the calamity that the Imperium would come to call the Pale Wasting. Chapter 33, The Pale Wasting. Malum Datum, 505.m34. The first sign the Imperium received of the new peril it faced was when a dozen worlds of the Eastern Fringe suddenly fell silent. Through the liberal deployment of anti-empiric matrices first designed to fight the Ildari and later perfected against the Enslaver Plague, these systems were unable to send astropathic messages, while their ships were destroyed by the Nightbringer's fleet before being able to escape. Though they were caught without warning due to the eldritch methods by which the Necrons traveled the stars, the border worlds of the Imperium were by necessity used to stand on their own against raiders and pirates both human and Xenos. The ease with which their space assets had been eliminated combined with the effects of the null zone spreading ahead of the Necron fleet shook them, but they prepared to defend themselves as best they could, bringing civilians to reinforced evacuation vaults and arming militias along with their PDF troops. When the Necrons made planetfall on each of these worlds, they found them ready to fight back. In each and every case, it was a complete slaughter. The human defenders were annihilated to the last, unable to stand against the superior technology of the Necrons. Tens of thousands of infantry were wiped out without doing any more damage than temporarily disable a few hundred Necron warriors, which were reassembled at once within the reconstruction forges of the attackers. Imperial commanders were killed in their most secure bunkers, either by teleporting deathmark assassins, wraiths phasing through walls, or flayed ones drawn from their extra-dimensional lairs by the carnage unleashed by the Nightbringer. Terror and powerlessness were all the unfortunate victims of the Necron onslaught had to look forward to, leading to a miserable death. Within a few months, billions had perished, mercilessly harvested by the Necron armies. The Nightbringer moved from world to world, feeding on the death and despair its slaves had wrought. Once the human population had been exterminated, the Necrons turned their engines toward the annihilation of all life on the planet down to the last microbe, a process directed by the destroyer lords the Nightbringer had made of the Larkorak nobles. With every world so consumed, the transcendent C'tan grew a little stronger, a little closer to its original, godlike power. Worlds falling out of contact was hardly an unheard of occurrence, and given the size of the Imperium and the inertia of imperial bureaucracy, especially where border worlds were concerned, it might have taken years for the Imperium to react to the Necron advance. But fortunately for humanity, the Segmentum authorities of the region had been put on high alert in recent months at the command of the Primarch Gilliman himself. The losses of contact were noted, and soon, by the standards of the galaxy-spanning Imperium at least, an alarm was sent up the chain of command. At first, the Imperial commanders believed this to be a new ploy by the traitor legions. But, mindful of the warning his brother had sent to him, Robert Gilliman suspected otherwise. Besides, the void in the warp his librarians claimed they felt in the affected region seemed at odds with their usual methods, as did the fact that an outright invasion of Imperial space went against the corrupting approach the heretics had adopted in the Long War. It was of course possible that one or more of the traitor primarches, or another influential figure among the heretics, were behind this, but the words of Sanguinius, precise, exact words, From someone the Avenging Sun knew not to be the kind to exaggerate or use misleading terms, hinted otherwise. On his legion's home world of Makridge, Guilliman had gathered a treasure trove of knowledge that the rest of the Imperium might deem too dangerous for mortal minds, but which few would dare question a Primarch for hoarding. Within the library of Ptolemy, the Avenging Sun had accumulated records salvaged from 1,000 ravaged worlds his legion had liberated during the Scouring. While a great deal of that lore concerned the archenemy and its myriad facets, and was sealed behind great psychic wards far from the reach of all but the highest-ranked Ultramarines, a not inconsiderable portion concerned the Xenos races that had survived the purges of the Great Crusade. Among these were records of ancient Eldar legends, transcribed by human scholars during the Dark Age of technology, prior to the fall of the Eldar Empire and the rise of the human Imperium. Within these scrolls, Guilliman found mentions of a deathless plague with which the Eldar's forebears had waged a terrible war in the distant past, and which, according to the Xenos, would one day return to the stars. Unfortunately, these records provided precious little concrete details as to the nature of this plague, but Guilliman wasn't discouraged by it. Instead, he saw it as more evidence of the scale of the threat, for either the Eldars themselves had dreaded to speak of this ancient foe, or its last rise was so far in the past that even the long-lived aliens didn't remember them as anything more than the vaguest of myths. Regardless, his duty was clear. The worlds of the Ultima Segmentum were under his protection, and Guilliman wouldn't let anyone, be they his treacherous brothers or so antediluvian Xenos menace, prey upon its worlds with impunity. The Primarch gave the orders, and a great fleet began to assemble on the borders of the Imperium, with the Ultramarines themselves providing the tip of the spear. The 13th Primarch had at his disposal the full might of the realm of Ultramar. The Ultramarines had always been one of, if not the most numerous legions, and despite the terrible losses they had sustained during the heresy, their numbers had been rebuilt since then. Beyond his own Gene sons, the Avenging Sun had also access to billions of loyal guardsmen, trained and equipped with the product of Ultramar's prodigious industry. Within months, a truly colossal armada had been mustered, and Guilliman left Makridge in order to lead it in person, forewarned by his brother that only he could stand against the dark terror that led this new yet ancient scourge. Meanwhile, as the Nightbringer's advance continued, its forces began to stretch thin, leading to several systems being attacked without the presence of the anti-empiric matrices. This allowed for terrified astropathic messages to be sent, not all of whom were of imperial origin or destination. Despite the efforts of the Inquisition and the Ministorum, the cults of the traitor legions could more easily take root on frontier worlds, and these cultists now called their distant masters for help as they too faced annihilation at the cold, unfeeling hands of the soulless Necrons. The dead are not safe, it sees me, I know it knows I know, the blade, the ship, the eye, the forge, the gods offer no succor from this pain. Collection of graffitis written in blood, found on the wall of a house on a world harvested by the Nightbringer. These astropathic communications served as beacons to Guilliman's relief force. While multiple systems were calling for aid, Guilliman hardened his heart and kept his fleet focused into one single group. At this stage of the campaign, information on the exact nature of the enemy was the most important objective. Several inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos and Hereticus, for not all shared the Primarch's conviction regarding the nature of the threat, were present in his fleet, along with their retinues and hundreds of magi of the Adeptus Mechanicus eager for specimens to dissect in the name of the Omnis Sia. A single engagement with overwhelming force on their side was, the Primarch decided, the best way to gain the information they desperately needed. Once a proper tactical doctrine had been built upon that knowledge, the fleet could be separated and sent to relieve the threatened worlds. It was a cold decision, but the Avenging Sun had become all too used to these during the heresy. The first true battle of the war took place in Kalidos, an otherwise unremarkable system with a single inhabited world and a handful of orbital installations. The stream of astropathic calls had suddenly ended, and the navigators of the fleet could sense only a great emptiness where the system had once stood, but Guilliman pressed on. When the fleet emerged piecemeal from the warp, it found that Kalidos still stood, though the entire system had fallen under the shadow of what the tech priests identified as an incredibly large null field. We are Necrons. Surrender and die. Sole message broadcast by the Xenos fleet in the Kalidos system, 505.M34. The ships orbiting Kalitos belonged to no category recorded in any of the Imperial fleet's data banks, and their speed and armaments were far superior to those of the Imperial ships. Many vessels and tens of thousands of lives were lost as information regarding their capabilities was collated, but eventually Guilliman managed to reach Kalitos' orbit and sent his legion down on the planet to rescue its beleaguered population. So began the first recorded battle between Space Marines and Necrons, though it would later be discovered that previous engagements had taken place, only to be erased from history at the command of the Emperor himself. It was a disaster. The armor of the Space Marine legions had been redesigned following the heresy in order to offer the best possible protection against those weapons most commonly fielded by traitor Astaroths, bolters and chainswords. They were little help against the gauze weaponry of the Necron hosts, however, as were the tactics of the 13th Legion, for the Necrons were unlike any enemy they had previously faced. Guilliman and his sons were nothing if not adaptable, however. Within days of the first engagements, the Avenging Sun had seized upon the two main weaknesses of this new and terrible foe, the slow speed of their troops, and the complete lack of imagination and inability to improvise of their commanders. The compiled observations of the Ultramarines and their allies made it clear to the Primarch that they were facing a foe that reacted more like a cogitator than a living being, which the appearance of the creatures seemed to confirm. By changing their tactics to focus on mobility, the Ultramarines were able to achieve much better results in subsequent engagements. Entire Necron divisions were wiped out in hit-and-run assaults inspired by the White Scars tactics, while random movements of troops threw the Necrons' machine mines for a loop and allowed the Imperials to catch them by surprise. Slowly, and at great cost, the Necrons were pushed out of Kalitos, though only a few tens of thousands remained of the planet's billion-strong population. Worse from the point of view of the war effort, thousands of Ultramarines had perished in the first days of the war, and few were in a state where their gene seed could be recovered. Few pieces of Necron technology had been obtained either, their infantry seemed to phase out whenever it was struck down, and high-resolution Auspex scanning of certain key figures within the invaders had led the Imperium to believe that these warriors were somehow repaired before being sent back to the field. The motives behind the attacks were also undecipherable. The sole transmission of the newly identified Necrons seemed to indicate genocidal aims, which fit with the Mechanicus views of soulless anima, but Guilliman wasn't satisfied with that explanation. The great engine responsible for the system-wide nullfield had also escaped, disappearing before it could be boarded by the 13th Legion's kill teams, which had at least allowed Guilliman to deploy his librarians and battle psychers, which had proven effective against the soulless Necrons. In any case, though Kalitos had been saved, many other systems called for help. Having partially accomplished his goal of securing the tactical information he required, Guilliman split his forces to answer as many calls as he could while keeping each battle group combat effective. He himself remained in command of the main force, while entrusting the others to proven Ultramarines captains or even Astra Militarum officers. The Primarch showed no favoritism in this, simply choosing those he believed were best suited for the arduous task awaiting them. After a few more battles, it became clear that the war against the Necrons would not be quickly ended. The Xenos' ability to repair their troops meant that they could recover all but the most grievous of casualties in time, and their mastery of teleportation technology, though it was obvious it operated on completely different principles than that used by the Imperium, meant that they could redeploy these repaired troops on the front lines nigh instantaneously. Destruction of the dolmen gates through which this teleportation was possible became an absolute priority, but it was still clear that the war would last years, perhaps decades. It was during that period that the name of Pale Wasting came into usage. It originated from observations by the Adeptus Mechanicus elements accompanying the Imperial forces battling the Necrons. They noted that the stars of systems where the Xenos menace had been present were weaker than records indicated they should be, their light slightly weaker, paler, than they ought to be. Combined with the psyche-crushing effect of fighting under the null fields of the anti-empiric matrices, the name of Pale Wasting came to be, eventually becoming official when Guilliman himself used it during a war council. This, the Primarch declared, was a trial for which the Kingdom of Ultramar, with its vast industrial base, productive population, and enormous manpower reserve, was perhaps best suited out of all of the Emperor's territories. Guilliman vowed that, no matter how long it took, he would send the Pale Wasting back to its graves, and its Dark Master into the oblivion it deserved. Elsewhere in the Eastern Fringe, the Nightbringer learned of this new obstacle to its plans. Whether it felt fury at being opposed by mere beings of flesh, amusement at the presumption of such insignificant creatures, or something else entirely, can only be guessed at. Chapter 34, The Moons of Kulberhel. Malum datum, 507.m34. The worlds of the eastern fringe were heavily policed, as populations far from the centers of imperial authority were more susceptible to infection by Horus-ian ideas and other heretical creeds. But even the best efforts of the Holy Ordos and the Adeptus Arbites couldn't keep the agents of the traitor legions from establishing a foothold. On the worlds ravaged by the Pale Wasting, these cultists had been harvested alongside the loyal subjects of the throne, their allegiance making no difference to the Necrons of the Nightbringer. But as the war continued, a few of them managed to send messages to their distant sponsors, desperate pleas for assistance and salvation in the face of this overwhelming nightmare. These calls reached the Eye of Terror, along with the reports of the spies embedded within the imperial bureaucracy, and word soon spread of this new threat Guilliman was facing. To Horus, this was an unpleasant surprise, a reminder so soon after the Cacodominus and the Howling that the galaxy contained many secrets that were yet unknown even to him. Part of the War Master rejoiced at the difficulties his brother faced, but the nature of the Pale Wasting disturbed even him. Horus desired to rule over humanity, and if the Pale Wasting triumphed there would be nothing to rule over. Furthermore, that the Dark Gods hadn't seen fit to reveal the existence of these Necrons and their eldritch overlords to him was yet another worrying sign that, for all the power they had bestowed upon him, the ruinous powers still only considered him a pawn rather than an ally. Trusting that the Avenging Sun would be able to contain the threat, the Prince of the Eye began to investigate. The Necrons were an old race, older even than the Chaos Gods themselves, but there were places in the Eye of Terror where the darkest secrets of the Eldar Empire yet survived, hoarded by powerful lords of the Changing God. Warbands were sent to the lairs of these Daemon Lords, led by members of Ahriman's Kabbalites, and kill teams sent to capture Eldar scholars for interrogation. Other powers, however, were less interested in the origins of the Necrons and more in their wondrous technology. Kulberhel, fallen fabricator general of the Mechanicum, had kept himself hidden since the siege of Terra and the exile into the Eye of Terror. He had renounced his alliance with Horus and cut off contact with the War Master, choosing to pursue his own blasphemous research away from the struggles and petty conflicts of the traitor legions. Only when the Inferna Astra had threatened to enslave the Dark Mechanicum to their madness had he emerged, and even then only to use his authority to give a rallying banner to the Dark Mechanicum so that they might face this mistake of the Thousand Suns with something approaching a united front. Now, however, the tales of the Xenos technology being unleashed across the eastern fringe caught the eye of the supreme arch-heretic. Thirst for knowledge and technology deemed forbidden to him had once driven Kulberhel to join Horus' rebellion and tear his own planet asunder with civil war, and exile hadn't diminished his obsession. He wasn't stupid, however, and knew that to leave the Eye of Terror would expose him to his many enemies in the Imperium. Instead, Kulberhel decided to send some of his apprentices, along with enough resources to be able to survive in a war zone of such peril the Imperium was expecting the conflict to last for years, even with a Primarch leading them. In the depths of his domain, he gathered armies and put his followers through tests that slew dozens of them before a handful were deemed worthy of leading the expedition to the eastern fringe. Meanwhile, 8 of the moons orbiting his primary Hellforge were prepared for a technological undertaking of a scale not seen since the Dark Age of technology. When Kulberhel put his plan into motion, its echoes were felt across the entire Ultima Segmentum, despite the quietude imposed on the warp by the Pale Wasting. One by one, the 8 moons he had selected were hurled through the warp, along with their entire population and industry, and emerged in the eastern fringe. The dark technology used to make this feat possible was based on the principles of Ulan Huda, the rogue predator moon allied to the Night Lords which had preyed upon the Thrumas sector during the heresy at the behest of the 8th Legion. How Kulberhel had acquired the secrets of Ulan Huda was unknown, but the arrival of the 8 moons of Kulberhel was yet another scourge unleashed upon the worlds of the border. The Nightbringer immediately detected the arrival of the moons, their method of travel reminding it of the great machines built by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven. Enraged by this reminder of its ancient and most hated foes, the Transcendent Citan commanded its slaves to destroy the rogue planetoids. But the moons were well defended, and the Dark Magi selected by Kulberhel to command them actually rejoiced at the first attacks, seeing it as their first opportunity to gain insight into the Necrons' technology. Dark tech shield generators kept the first Necron harvesting fleets from annihilating the moons from afar, but couldn't prevent them from teleporting their deathless legions on the surface. Taken by surprise by the sudden arrival of their foes on the Predator moons, the Dark Mechanicum suffered greatly in the first battles, struggling to bring their hordes of Dark Skitarii and Heretic horrors in position to face the invaders. But like the Imperium and unlike the Necrons, the Dark Mechanicum could adapt. Within days, they had shifted the frequency of their shields to prevent Necron teleportation within key installations, and make it more complex and energy-consuming everywhere else. Necron warriors were captured and, after much trial and error, prevented from phasing back to their crypts or to self-destruct so that the Dark Magi could study them. It was perhaps merciful for them that the Nightbringer had destroyed the last shreds of their minds when it had taken over the dynasty, as Kulberhal's adepts were far from gentle in their studies. With the arrival of the first anti-empiric matrix, however, the tides of the battle swiftly changed. Much of the Dark Mechanicum's forces were utterly dependent on the warp to function, and while most were able to avoid being completely disabled, for had the anti-empiric matrices be all-powerful, the war in heaven would have ended much sooner, their potency was still diminished. In order to stop this Necron engine from crippling them, the Dark Mechanicum deployed kill teams of Alpha Legionnaires, whose services Kulberhal had bought for this war in return for vast shipments of Astaroth's weaponry and ammunition. Using their own technology of unknown origins, 2 companies of the 20th Legion were able to board the anti-empiric matrix and disable it, before escaping back to the closest Predator moon with valuable samples, though they took heavy casualties in the process, and the Dark Magi couldn't help but notice that there were a few fewer samples than the number of transports that had escaped could feasibly have carried. To prevent another anti-empiric matrix from being deployed and affecting them all at the same time, the Predator moons scattered across the eastern fringe. The Nightbringer sent its forces in pursuit, and entire star systems became battlegrounds between the 2 enemies of the Imperium. Worlds that had thus far been spared the horrors of the Pale Wasting were caught in the crossfire of the Heretic-Necron conflict, trapped between foes equally inimical to their continued existence. What befell them instead was arguably worse. In order to replenish their stockpiles of ore and flesh, the Predator moons preyed upon them, stripping them of all useful resources. Whole populations were herded into conversion facilities, where men and women alike were fitted with brutish cybernetic implants and branded with unholy sigils, their minds and souls blasted by exposure to dark tech until they were but puppets of the Dark Magi. Entire land masses were broken down to fuel the ravenous hunger of the Predator moons, whose forges had been designed by Kulberhal's mad genius to be able to build tanks and daemon engines by the hundred, and were even capable of constructing Chaos Knights, using corrupted STC schematics and levels of automation that the sacred creeds of the Adeptus Mechanicus forbade. Unlike the massed infantry of their Dark Skitarii, these war machines required competent pilots still in possession of their faculties, for while daemons could be used as replacements, there was only so much rituals of binding could do to force them to follow orders. To overcome this challenge, the Heretecs used memory clones of a handful of renegade nobles from the Night Houses that had sided with the rebellion during the heresy. Fully grown bodies were decanted with engine mills and implanted with the memories of these nobles through intrusive cybernetic implants, before being permanently bonded to the command throne of a newly forged knight and sent into the fray. Those who survived their first battle had their memories copied and added to the records of the corrupted Noosphere, along with the last memories of those who died while still in range of the data harvesters. This process soon turned every single memory clone, whose sanity had never been that strong in the first place, utterly psychotic, as they remembered dying dozens of times yet still lived. Their Dark Mechanicum overseers didn't care for this, however, so long as the Chaos Knights could fight, which they very much could. Witnessing these rival harvests, the Necrons accelerated their own efforts, resulting in morbid races between the 2 factions to be the first to commit genocide upon the worlds of the Eastern Fringe. In some cities, those who had witnessed the merciless slaughter enacted by the Necrons willingly gave themselves to the Dark Mechanicum in the vain hope it would at least allow them to fight back, not having any idea of the horrors that awaited them. In others, the civilians threw themselves before the Necron legions by the millions, that their deaths might at least be quick. In the end, both methods resulted in worlds devoid of life, though the Dark Mechanicum's methods were far more destructive. Some of the hives emptied by the Necrons still stood almost intact after their departure, save for a few traces of battle, as if all the billions of inhabitants had simply left. Thus was opened another front in the war against the Pale Wasting, though it would take some time before Guilliman realized exactly what had happened. The Dark Mechanicum was prepared to fight for years, decades even, in order to gather the knowledge Kulberhal demanded of them. Soon, however, the sheer power the arch-heretics were able to command so far from the dominating gaze of their lord made them start questioning their allegiance to the former fabricator general. In the Eye of Terror, they had been servants, but in the Eastern Fringe, they were warlords and kings. They did not speak those thoughts aloud, and only thought them on their most well-protected of implanted cogitators, far from the sight of the agents Kulberhal had doubtlessly left on the Predator moons to ensure their loyalty. But the idea grew nonetheless, little by little. In each battle they watched unfold through the eyes of 1,000 dark Skitarii, manipulating millions of troops like pieces on a game board in their war against the Necrons or possessing them like puppets, experiencing the intensity of battle by proxy before discarding their vessels as soon as they fell in battle. Chapter 35, Unexpected Allies. Malum Datum, 510.m34. 5 years after its beginning, the war against the Pale Wasting had laid waste to entire sectors. Scores of worlds and hundreds of billions had perished, harvested by the Necron legions or annihilated as their worlds were scoured clean of life by the terrible weapons of the fallen dynasty. Those few Imperial souls who survived to see them being used came to call such weapons nightmare engines, while the Necrons themselves were often referred to as a star-spawned plague in the fiery speeches of the Imperial preachers accompanying the Astra Militarum forces. Yet now, at last, things were beginning to turn in the favor of the Imperium. With its attention divided between two enemies, one of which made blatant use of the warp and therefore earned the greater share of its anger, the strategic mind of the Nightbringer, which, among the star gods, had never been the greatest, began to make mistakes. As the transcendent Citan focused its attention on the Dark Mechanicum, dedicating more resources to tracking down and destroying the Predator moons, the forces of the Pale Wasting waned on other fronts, giving the Imperium its first real chance to push back. Kulberhal had chosen the destination of his Predator moons carefully, far from the systems reclaimed by the Imperium under Guilliman. Even so, the method of transportation used meant that their arrival was far from unnoticed. Psykers all across the segmentum were haunted by visions of the horrors wrought by the Dark Mechanicum, and thousands perished in the resulting demonic incursions. Though this benefited him from a strategic perspective, Guilliman wasn't so foolish as to be glad of the news. He had witnessed what the Dark Mechanicum was capable of, and doubted that the heretics' methods had become any less monstrous in their exile to the Eye of Terror. Not only were the human worlds caught in the conflict between the renegades and the Necrons doomed to terrible fates, but the prospect of the Dark Magi succeeding in learning the secrets of Necron technology was a chilling one. Unbeknownst to Guilliman, other factions had begun to take action against the Pale Wasting in the Eastern Fringe. After their scouts had failed to report, the Necron Praetorians had employed other methods to confirm the fate of the Larkorak dynasty. They had then brought word of this terrible threat to the crown world of Mandragora, where the first nobles of the Sodok dynasty had begun to awaken from the Great Sleep. Though Necrons had left fear behind during biotransference, the idea of a transcendent Nightbringer loose in the galaxy filled them with dread. The Praetorians ordered that those tomb worlds in the path of the Pale Wasting be immediately emptied of all warriors and resources, with the other Citan shards taking absolute priority, regardless of the damage removing them might cause to the necropolises. At the same time, small raiding parties of the Sodok were sent to eliminate nobles of the Larkorak dynasty who had fallen under the thrall of the Nightbringer, to expunge the dishonor of such worthies of the Necron race being reduced to slaves of the star gods once more. For the first time since the end of the Secession Wars, Necron fought Necron, and in those few occurrences where Imperial observers were present and survived, the following reports that found their way to Guilliman's desk were very confused indeed. Another party had also become interested in the events of the Eastern Fringe. Trazyn the Infinite, Necron Overlord of Solemnus, had learned of the Nightbringer's awakening and subjugation of the Larkorak. The obsessive historian and collector feared the transcendent Citan as much as any other Necron lord, but was unwilling to let such a momentous occasion pass without being present to record it. Though none of the Aletok Rangers had returned, the visions of the Craftworld seers showed them the atrocities committed by the Nightbringer upon the human worlds, and the growing power of the Ingur, both so great as to be visible even through the shroud of psychic silence, especially as it was overstretched and slowly torn apart by the war against the Predator moons of the Dark Mechanicum. The Eldars cared little for the fate of Mon-Ki, but they knew that the Necrons needed to be stopped. Craftworld Samhan operated in the eastern fringe, though its warriors had remained far from the Pale Wasting. The Eldars knew that, should the Nightbringer learn of their Craftworld's presence, it would stop at nothing to hunt them down. In every future the seers of Samhan saw where the transcendent Citan realized the distant descendants of the Eldari it had fought during the war in heaven were within its reach. Only doom awaited the children of Isha. The anti-empiric matrices meant that deploying the war hosts of Aletok was impossible. Too much of the Eldar's technology and battle prowess relied upon the warp. That the humans had managed to fight back against the Pale Wasting was a sign of how even primitives could have their use, or so the seers of Aletok presented the situation to their prideful autarchs. After much discussion, it was decided that the human leader, the Primarch Guilliman, must be contacted and told of the true nature of the foe he fought, so that he could be directed efficiently against the Ingur before it feasted on so many souls as to become unstoppable. Farseer Kylian, who had led his peers' efforts in convincing the Craftworld's leaders of the necessity of this course of action, was named leader of this diplomatic expedition, and promptly departed for the eastern fringe alongside an escort judged large enough to guarantee his safety but small enough not to anger the humans. Unwilling to waste more time wading through bureaucracy, Kylian went directly for Guilliman's location, on the very front lines of the war against the Pale Wasting. The Farseer timed his arrival to follow the destruction of the anti-empiric matrix deployed in this area, scrying the threads of the future at great personal effort and pain until his vision cleared, indicating the engine's destruction. Only when he was sure the monstrous machine had been destroyed did he order his ship to enter the system and reveal itself to the humans. Lord Rabut Guilliman, son of the human emperor, enemy of the scion of she who thirsts. I am Farseer Kylian of Craftworld Aletok. I come in peace, bearing knowledge of the enemy you face. Transmission from the Eldar vessel Blade of Kurnus to the Ultramarine Armada. Guilliman knew the story of the fall, and knew well too how many human worlds had suffered the depredations of the Eldars during the Age of Strife, when entire civilizations had been treated as larders by degenerate raiders who would return every generation to feed on the terror and pain of their victims before vanishing, confident that those they oppressed couldn't possibly fight back. He knew too of how the Craftworld Eldars, for all that they claimed to have renounced the violent way of their dark kin, still saw no issue with slaughtering billions of humans for the crime of having been born on one of the worlds the aliens claimed as theirs, despite centuries having passed since the landing of the colonization fleets. And of course, the Avenging Sun knew too how the Eldars had made alliance with hundreds of Imperial commanders across the galaxy, claiming to be opposing the schemes of the archenemy, only to abandon their supposed allies to fates worse than death the moment the safety of their own people was guaranteed. That they should come to him now, when the Imperium faced a horror spawned from antediluvian legend, was no surprise to Guilliman, and he knew better than to trust a single word from them. Yet he needed information, for though the Imperium held against the Pale Wasting, losses were mounting and there was no end in sight. So it was that Primarch and Farseer met aboard the Makraj Zahner, despite the objections of many on Guilliman's council. Kylian told the Avenging Sun what his people knew of the Necrons and their terrible star god, and the fact that the Ingur would only grow stronger as it fed, until it grew so mighty it might well devour the galaxy entire. Learning that the Necrons weren't limited to the Pale Wasting but were in fact scattered across the galaxy, slumbering in their tombs where any fool explorer might stumble upon them and awaken them, was unwelcome news for Guilliman, but he absorbed them as he had absorbed so many more in his life. Kylian agreed that the rest of the Necron race was a threat. His people, after all, had fought a guerrilla war against the Tomb Worlds for thousands of years. There were even fragmentary records in the Craftworld from the time before the fall, hinting that Aletok had inherited the duty of an older Eldari order, though one that had been slowly crippled by the growing decadence of their empire, as with so many others. Yet those sleeping metal devils were a concern for later when compared to those awake and currently harvesting the stars to feed their hungry god. The distraction the Dark Mechanicum had presented to the Pale Wasting would not last much longer, warned the Farseer. The Nightbringer itself had abandoned its feeding to track down the Predator moons, and before its awesome power the Source Rouse artifices of Kulberhal's apprentices could not hope to prevail. One by one they would fall, though not even the transcendent Citan would be able to completely exterminate the med-things of metal and flesh that dwelled within. It must be stopped before that grim possibility could come to pass, but the technology which had held it captive for millions of years was beyond either of them, and with its increased power, it was doubtful the Necrons themselves had anything which could contain it. Still, there remained a path to victory, narrow and treacherous though it may be. The seers of Aletok could not predict the actions of the Nightbringer, save through the sudden ending that came to most threads that crossed its path, but they knew of a world where its arrival was inevitable. There, Kylian told Guilliman, they would have a chance at slaying the Dark God at the heart of the Pale Wasting and defeat the blight that had spread across the eastern fringe. The world's name was Cronus, and their legend would be written, as ever, in blood. Chapter 36, The Battle of Cronus. Malum Datum, 510.m34. Despite its isolation and lack of apparent strategic value, Cronus was a world with significant history. Eons ago, it had been conquered by the Sodok dynasty and, at the end of the War in Heaven, had been made into one of the Necrons' tomb worlds, where they had slumbered during the Great Sleep. Millions of Necron warriors slept below the world's surface, hidden away in great crypts that had endured the passage of galactic epochs more or less undamaged. Such had been the importance of Cronus in that age that a shard of the Nightbringer itself was contained there, imprisoned within a tesseract vault that had endured better than the one on the Larkorak crown world. In more recent times, during the Horus Heresy, Cronus had been the site of violent battles between the Ultramarines and the Word-Bearers, the latter led by the Dark Apostle Eliphaz the Inheritor. Eliphaz's plans to build a basilica dedicated to the ruinous powers on Cronus had come to naught when his Primarch had summoned him, castigating him for wasting manpower and resources on a distraction to the greater war. Still, traces of that bloody fratricidal war yet remained on Cronus, waiting for but a spark to animate them once more. As news of the Pale Wasting reached the Eye of Terror, Eliphaz had attempted to use the cults he had cultivated on the planet, only to fail miserably, as the local imperial authorities managed to locate and eliminate the cultists before their work in the Deimos Peninsula could be completed. The combined imperial fleet arrived in Cronus first, to the shock and awe of its population. For years now, they had heard rumors of the wars raging across the eastern fringe, though they'd remained untouched so far. Learning this was about to change terrified the governor, but he immediately began preparations to protect his people, driven to do his duty by the presence of the avenging sun. In an impressive display of logistics, the people of Cronus were evacuated and shipped off to Ultramar, where great refugee cities had been built to welcome those who had fled before the Pale Wasting with typical efficiency. Cronus abandoned cities became fortified camps for millions of guardsmen, while orbital forts were towed in the system, and Ultramarine scouts located the entrances to the Necron crypts. 3 months after Guilliman's arrival at Cronus, the Nightbringer and its Pale Wasting appeared, and the battle began. The C'tan had brought no less than 3 of its anti-empiric matrices, and their combined effect on the humans was devastating. Entire regiments were lost without ever firing a shot or even seeing the enemy, their will to live sapped by the soul-deadening effect of the Necron engines. The cults of chaos that Dark Apostle Eliphaz had sponsored were afflicted worst of all, driven to suicide in the middle of the ritual that would have allowed the Inheritor's warriors to reach Cronus and strike at Guilliman. It was fortunate for Eliphaz that he had kept the details of his plan to himself, and that mortal cultists failing to perform Magnus' ritual of portal creation was a common occurrence. Had the rest of the Word-Bearers realized he had missed the opportunity to strike at their hated foe, the 13th Legion, his future would have been a bleak one indeed. The Imperial ships were similarly afflicted, but for once the fanatical priests of the Ecclesiarchy proved their usefulness to Guilliman. Space Marines could fight through the soul-deadening field through sheer will, like Guilliman himself, but in mere men and women the fires of faith proved an adequate substitute, and fiery sermons broadcast across entire vessels allowed their crew to keep doing their duties even under the weight of that crushing psychic void. They engaged the Xenos fleet, and the void of Cronus was soon filled with the bright flares of dying warships. At the same time, battle was joined on the surface of Cronus, the Necrons not needing anything so crude as troop transports to land their forces on the planet. By then the Adeptus Mechanicus had managed to cobble together devices that prevented the Necrons from simply teleporting in the middle of their strongholds, using a brute force approach that had eventually worked, though no 2 tech priests could agree on why. The hosts of the Nightbringer had taken losses during the war, and unlike Guilliman the C'tan had no allies to call upon to replenish its silent legions. It lacked too the innate techno-sorceress lore some of its kind were recorded to have possessed in Eldar myths, perhaps it never had held it, or perhaps it had lost such knowledge during its sundering. Regardless, while its enslaved Cryptex could restore defeated Necrons from all but the most absolute of destruction and perform minor repairs on the greater engines of the Pale Wasting, they couldn't build new ones, or repair those destroyed by the Imperium and the Dark Mechanicum. Only by plundering more tomb worlds could the Pale Wasting recover and grow, and the Triarch Praetorians had managed to empty those it had found before, but not Cronus. Glitches in the Ace of the Sodic dynasty, combined with the secrecy imposed on all tomb worlds hiding a shard of the Nightbringer, resulted in the Lords of Mandragora no longer remembering the planet's location, and in some cases its existence. Only one Necron overlord did, the infamous rogue Trazyn the Infinite, and he was more interested in salvaging any historical relic on Cronus than he was emptying its crypts of common warriors to deny them to the transcendent C'tan. The Imperials had avoided disturbing the crypts, unwilling to rouse the Necrons from their slumber and add further complications to the battle. They had instead elected to guard the entrances to the tombs, unaware that the Nightbringer could simply break in using teleportation. Or rather it could have, had Trazyn's thievery not caused the tomb-guarding AI to raise its defenses to their maximum level, preventing even the transcendent C'tan from forcing its way inside lest it damage the resources it desired to claim. Instead, it was forced to attack the entrances in order to gain access, while also sending its legions against the human population centers. The whole of Cronus shook as humanity fought against the Pale Wasting, but of the Nightbringer itself, there was still no sign. Guilliman had taken to the field in person, leading his Ultramarines on the planet against the greatest concentration of the foe. Had the battle been allowed to reach its end like this, perhaps the Imperium would have prevailed, though it would have lost nearly all its forces on Cronus in the effort. But Guilliman, and Farseer Kylian, had other plans. The Avenging Sun had kept one of his greatest forces from the battlefield, and now that the Pale Wasting was committed he gave the order to unleash them. The Black Templars, those sons of Dorn who had dedicated themselves to hunting down the enemies of man while their Genesire held the Cadian Gate against the arch-traitor and his foul minions, had answered the call of Guilliman in force. Several of their crusades had come to fight the Pale Wasting, merging into one singular fleet under the command of none other than Sigismund, the founder and High Marshal of their order. A veteran of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, Sigismund was millennia old, and the wounds he had sustained in the course of his duty had long since required his burial within a dreadnought sarcophagus. But his zeal for the God Emperor burned bright still, for among the legions Astaroth's the Black Templars were unique in that they had espoused the Ecclesiarchy's creed, believing the Master of Mankind to be a deity in truth, despite his vehement denials of it during the Great Crusade. That faith had seen the Black Templars grow ever more isolated from their more secular cousins, but now it served them well, for they did not have librarians for the anti-empiric matrices to cripple, and appeared wholly unaffected by the other effects of the field. At Guilliman's signal, their ships threw themselves at the great engines, unleashing thousands of black-clad transhuman killers upon them, tasked with the single purpose of disabling the matrices no matter the cost. And the cost indeed was great, for nigh on 10,000 Black Templars went into the jaws of death, and less than 4,000 of them made it out. Worse, from the perspective of the Black Templars, Sigismund himself had perished in the attack. But the Sons of Dorn fulfilled their mission, and as the 6th Cronusian dawn rose above the planetary battlefields, the last of the anti-empiric matrices was undone. Immediately, the stasis fields that had held the librarians of the 13th Legion and the battle psychers of the Astra Militarum were switched off, and they unleashed the full array of their powers upon the deathless Xenos. Then came the Nightbringer in all its horrific majesty, enraged by the loss of yet more of its great engines of woe. It scythed through guardsmen, Skitarii, and ultramarines alike, shrugging off artillery fire and even the wrath of the Mechanicus' own god machines. In what passed for its eldritch mind, it recognized Guilliman as the leader of its enemies, and moved toward the Primarch, determined to devour that most radiant and powerful of souls as first repayment for the losses it had endured. But the human psychers were not the only force returned to the field by the destruction of the anti-empiric matrices. As Primarch and Transcendent C'tan finally faced one another, Guilliman beholding the true face of the Pale Wasting and finding it more terrible still than the Daemon Prince his brother Fulgrim had become, the Eldars of Aletok made their move. They emerged from inactive webway gates that had been smuggled on Cronus by agents of Guilliman whose loyalty was such they would not question such orders, led by Farseer Kylian, and began their work. At the cost of thousands of lives and great peril to his own, Guilliman had drawn the Nightbringer to a specified point, where the etheric currents waxed strongest on all of Cronus. There, the Eldar spellweavers drew upon the fullness of their power, which they always kept themselves from to avoid drawing Slaanish's hungry gaze. Their souls flared bright, and as one they struck the transcendent C'tan. Lightning descended from the heavens and struck the sundered god, once, twice, 3 times in as many heartbeats. With every strike, a score of Eldar were lost, their bodies burning to ash and less than ash, their soul stones cracked by the terrible energies they were wielding. This was a price they had all known they might pay, and they paid it willingly, for they were children of Aletok, sworn to oppose the deathless horrors at any cost. For all these sacrifice, the Nightbringer wasn't brought low so easily. It had feasted on billions of souls since its liberation, and on the stuff of the stars themselves. It would take more than the petty sorcery wielded by the degenerate descendants of its ancient foes' slaves to end a being that had existed since the dawn of the universe. There was a reason, after all, that mighty Surak himself, the silent king of the Necrons, had chosen to break the C'tan rather than kill them. It was no small thing to slay a god, and not one without consequences. But Robert Guilliman was willing to suffer those consequences so long as the people of his father's Imperium were kept safe from the pale wasting. The Avenging Sun struck the weakened Nightbringer with his 2 gauntlets of Ultramar, each weapon infused with technology now lost to the Imperium, crafted in the heydays of humanity and reforged for him by the greatest tech priests of Mars. With these weapons, Guilliman had struck down aliens, traitors, and daemons. Again the Eldars called down lightning, pouring their very souls into the attacks, reasoning annihilation was a better fate than what awaited their spirits on the other side. On their own, the Eldars couldn't have hoped to defeat the Nightbringer, who had stood against the power of the Old Ones and emerged triumphant. But Robert Guilliman had been gene-forged by the Emperor himself, and like all of his brothers he had imbued the Avenging Sun with the power to slay the false gods he sought to free mankind from. Drawing upon that power within him, Guilliman at last delivered a final blow, unraveling the infinitely complex matrix of energy that made up the transcendent C'tan's core. Yet even in his triumph, Guilliman fell, trapped in a state that was neither life nor death by the final curse of the Nightbringer as its eternal existence was at last unmade. His sons found him in death-like sleep, and brought him back to Makridge, where all their efforts to wake him failed. In the end, they interred him in the fortress of Hera, with 10 Terminators assigned to keep watch over him at all time lest one of the Primarch's many enemies sought to finish what the Xenos godling had begun. In the Eye of Terror, Fulgrim roared in displeasure as he sensed the Avenging Sun's fall, having hungered for the blood of Guilliman since he'd been denied it by Sanguinius thousands of years ago. To take his mind off this lost pleasure, the White Naga indulged in such excess that entire worlds outside the Eye were overcome by its psychic echoes, their population succumbing to madness and destroying itself in hedonistic orgies. The entire Imperium shook with grief at the news that one of the Emperor's sons had fallen. The Inquisition had intended to keep the details of the war against the Pale Wasting as secret as possible, but the involvement and loss of a Primarch made that impossible. From the Outer Rim to the throne world itself, the bells of mourning rang, in some cases without pause for years on end. The Avenging Sun and all those who had perished in the war against the Pale Wasting were honored on Holy Terra, their names recorded in the Halls of Heroes, along with a plaque said to have been engraved by the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes on behalf of the Emperor himself. Upon it were inscribed the words, "By their mortal sacrifice and unmatched valor unmade that which cannot die and so preserved the most holy realm of mankind." Those few Eldar who had survived the Battle of Cronus withdrew immediately through their webway gates, knowing that without Guilliman to vouch for them the alliance was at an end. The Eldritch Arches crumbled to dust behind them, and though its losses were but a fraction of those the Imperium had sustained on Cronus alone, it would be many cycles before Aletok recovered from the sacrifices it had made to stop the Nightbringer. Hundreds of its most powerful Psykers had given their life to strike the Ingur, yet in the end it had come down to the might of the Monkey King, a tale which found little favor in the craft worlds. To ensure that no threat like the Pale Wasting ever rose again, a new organization was founded, the Death Watch. Composed of veteran space marines from all loyalist legions, it would hunt down the Xenos menace within its own lair. They would serve as the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, whose influence had waned in the days since the proclamation of Horus. From hundreds of void fortresses scattered across the galaxy they would stand guard, with the first and greatest of these being deployed in the eastern fringe. It was from them that the name Death Watch came, for they were to keep watch over the dead, lest they stir anew to bring ruination upon the emperor's realm. The Inquisition was more successful in suppressing the truths revealed to Guilliman by Farseer Kilian, and which the avenging son had shared with his closest confidants. The Pale Wasting was said to be the remnants of a Xenos empire throwing itself at the Imperium after its leader had gone mad, and the existence of the other Necron dynasties was kept secret. Inquisitorial agents and Mechanicu's exploration teams began to search for the tombs of the Necrons, to quarantine or plunder them. The involvement of the Dark Mechanicum was silenced, with entire systems being declared forbidden lest someone stumble upon the remnants of the terrible weapons used by both sides of that awful conflict. The wrecks of the Predator moons disabled and scoured clean of life and power by the Nightbringer were hurled into the closest star by servitor-crewed tugboats that followed them into fiery oblivion. Not all of Kulberhal's apprentices had perished, however. Some of them had fled before the Nightbringer had come for them, abandoning the priceless Predator moons despite knowing doing so would earn them the Fabricator General's eternal displeasure. Taking with them the most prized treasures of the war and the knowledge they had gained from studying the Necrons, they went into exile in the Eastern Fringe, establishing small enclaves where they continued their blasphemous research. In time, Horasian agents would reach out to these isolated enclaves, and offer them a partnership. The Dark Mechanicum would provide weapons and tools for the various cults and rebellions sponsored by the Prince of the Eye, and in return would receive resources and technological relics. It was an agreement that suited both sides, though the Horasians wouldn't remain the sole patrons of the exiles for long. In the centuries to come, the Eastern Fringe and the entire Segmentum would be plagued by the legacy of Kulberhal, and many tech priests would be tempted down heretical paths by the dark wonders of the exiled Magi. Kulberhal himself seemed satisfied with the lore his apprentices had sent back to him before their defeat, and didn't see it fit to waste resources hunting down his renegade students. On Mandragora, the relief of the Necron Lords was short-lived. Soon after the defeat of the Pale Wasting, the Triarch Praetorians returned in force to the Crown World, and used the secret protocols of the Silent King to erase all memory of the event, as well as all records that the Larkorak dynasty had ever existed. This was done to preserve the image of invincibility of the Necrons and their Silent King, and keep any from wondering just how it was that a lesser race like the humans had managed to defeat a transcendent Citan of such power, as well as to keep any from questioning the wisdom of Surak in ordering the Great Sleep given that they had forgotten about an entire tomb world as a result. This was not the first time such memory-altering protocols had been used, and by the end, only one Necron overlord remembered the Pale Wasting outside of the Praetorians' ranks, for Treize in the Infinite was cunning, and had ensured the Praetorians only thought they had wiped out his own recollection of the events. He did not think it treason against the Silent King. After all, how was a historian to do his work if his own knowledge of the past was questionable? Sanguinius wept. The Primarch of the Blood Angel was alone, kneeling on the cold stones of an abandoned imperial church. There, before the image of his father that had been carved centuries ago by a man who had never seen him, Sanguinius wept for his brother. He hadn't known what would happen to Guilliman, but he had known the possibility of his brother's death existed. And yet, there had been nothing he could do. Too much of him was invested in the legend of the Great Angel, too much of his essence was intertwined with the prayers and hopes of trillions of souls across the galaxy. The anti-warp weapons of the Pale Wasting would have unmade him, would have reduced him to a shadow of his current self. And the Imperium needed him, much as it burned his soul to think of it like that. Horus was still out there, plotting in the Eye of Terror. Sanguinius could see glimpses of his treacherous brother's schemes unfurling in the future, and knew with absolute certainty that it was the inevitability of their confrontation which kept the arch-traitor in his lair. He had to stay alive, a symbol and a sword hanging over Horus' head. Even as his brothers vanished or fell, Sanguinius must endure. His father had commanded this of him, and he would not disobey. And so he wept, mourning his lost brother and the shame of his inability to save him. Chapter 37, Secrets of the First Legion. Malium Datum, 584.m34. The rise of the Cacodominus and the Pale Wasting had reminded Horus that, for all his power and influence in the Eye of Terror and beyond, there were still things in the galaxy beyond his ability to control or predict. This was not a pleasant reminder for the Prince of the Eye, who had salvaged his wounded pride after the siege of Terra and the broken conclave by engineering the current form of the Long War. To be forced to confront that fact that he was but a player on the stage rather than the puppet master was a sobering thought, but it did nothing to make him reconsider his ambition. No matter the cost or how winding the path, he would ascend to his rightful place as the true master of mankind and lord of the galaxy. His attempt to influence the secretive leagues of Votan and turn them to his side had also ended in failure, with the leagues closing their borders to all outsiders in an effort to keep themselves free of the taint of chaos. Yet the failure hadn't been absolute. By isolating themselves, the squad abhumans had also removed the possibility of them rejoining the Imperium and bringing their ancient technology in service to the rest of humanity. This, Horus saw, was how he must act from now on, not with a singular plan upon whose success rested the entire war, but with many, each of which tailored so as to benefit him in the long term regardless of the outcome, each with the potential of shifting the entire balance of galactic power. One of these plans had been centuries in the making, and at last all the pieces were in place. The Imperium was still recovering from the war against the Pale Wasting and the loss of Guilliman, whose leadership had played a large part in keeping the Ultima Segmentum under control since the heresy. Sanguinius was far from the centers of imperial power, gone fighting Zeno's empires enslaved by the ruinous powers in their more dreadful aspects, those which they hid from humanity in order to prosper in the long war's more subtle games. It began with a single astropathic message, sent by the governor of Pandora in the Veiled Region to the Inquisition. In it, the governor, who was secretly in league with the War Master of Chaos, reported unrest on his world, and sigils of the ruinous powers being observed among the insurgents. As a faithful servant of the God Emperor, the governor now called for aid, that his people may receive the Inquisition's most holy aid and his world preserved from the taint of heresy. By this point the Ordos had centuries of experience fighting the cults sponsored by the traitor legions, and the forces they dispatched to Pandora were veterans of this type of investigation and purging. They were on the lookout for any sign of the heretic Astartes' involvement, and soon their interrogation of captured cultists revealed the presence of one of the transhuman traitors on Pandora. After much adventure, the Inquisitors managed to corner the heretic in question, in the stronghold he had built in the depths of Pandora Prime's underhive. His name was Obadiah Hrakan, and he was one of the fallen, who had been delivered to Pandora straight from Caliban by Luther's last spell. The machinations of Horus had ensured his arrival on a world already sworn to the Prince of the Eye's cause, and the rebellion the fallen had joined in his bitterness at the Imperium that had destroyed his home world had been carefully cultivated to draw the Inquisition's eye, but not that of the ever-watchful First Legion. Obadiah fought well, but he was just one space marine in the end, and through the intervention of deep-cover Horusian agents the fallen angel was captured alive and put to the question. His gene seed was tested, and proved to be of the First Legion. This by itself wasn't that alarming. All loyalist legions had their renegades, though none liked to discuss it and all considered it a source of deep shame. But Obadiah's testimony, a tale of rebellion hearkening back to the Horus heresy itself and which had, according to him, divided the Dark Angels themselves, was unprecedented. Of course, the Inquisition didn't put much worth in the word of a single traitor. But this required investigation nonetheless, especially as there were records in the Ordo's archives of warriors in the defiled livery of the First Legion fighting alongside the Sons of Horus during the Black Crusade that had preceded the proclamation. Records of Obadiah's confession and images of his armor were compiled into a data archive and sent to the Dark Angels' mobile stronghold of the Rock, to inform them of Obadiah's capture, interrogation, and subsequent execution at the hand of the Holy Ordos. An inquisitor was chosen to accompany this package, in order to impress upon the Dark Angels the importance of ongoing loyalty and vigilance against the taint of chaos, which can creep into even the stoutest of fortresses if given but a moment's opportunity. The first phase of Horus' plan was complete. Aboard the Penitent's Blade, Inquisitor Gabriel Hinodefer journeyed across half the galaxy in search of the Rock. His quest lasted for years, and took him to other worlds where he did the work of the Ordo Hereticus, pausing for weeks or months while his ship repaired and refueled before departing again, a trail of blazing pyres and quieter deaths marking his passage. Eventually, 10 years after the events of Pandora, he found the mobile fortress monastery of the Dark Angels. Using his authority as an inquisitor, he demanded an audience with Armoros, the 12th Supreme Grand Master and leader of the First Legion in the absence of Lionel Johnson. Even one such as Armoros, who held authority and power to rival that of the High Lords, had to grant such a request. For millennia, the Dark Angels had kept their shameful history from the Imperium, as well as from the other Primarchs. Even among the Dark Angels themselves, only a select few, the inner circle, were aware of the truth of what had transpired during the final days of Caliban. The rest of the Legion had been kept ignorant, through vows of secrecy imposed in the aftermath of Luther's rebellion upon those who had fought in that final battle. They had hunted down the fallen with alacrity, and their obsession with secrecy and deep-seated paranoia born from the lion's blood and Luther's betrayal had served them well in the centuries since the proclamation had altered the nature of the long war. Now, however, these gifts would turn against them. Armoros was shocked to his core when Henodefer told him of Obadiah Hraken's capture on Pandora. The traitor's name was on the records of the fallen that the First Legion had recovered from Caliban's ruins. For one of the fallen to be slain by the Inquisition without being given a chance to repent in the rock's cells was one thing, hardly unexpected given how far Luther's followers had been spread. There had been several times when this had happened already, with the hunters of the Deathwing following rumors of a fallen's presence only to find the Inquisition had already killed them. But for the Ordos to have a transcript of Caliban's end, however partial and limited, for them to know of the ancient shame, even if only in a single renegade's words, this was Armoros' every nightmare made real. In the days following the destruction of their home world and the disappearance of their Primarch, the Dark Angels had concealed the truth out of fear as much as shame, and the centuries of keeping the truth hidden had only added new sins to their tally. Nowadays, Armoros believed, like most of the inner circle, that the Imperium would destroy the First Legion if it learned the truth, and that was something the Supreme Grand Master couldn't accept, not while there were still fallen to hunt and the lion to honor. The Inquisitor noted his host's distress, but assumed it was due to learning that one of his legion had turned renegade. He reassured the Supreme Grand Master that the downfall of one did not invalidate the faithfulness of the many, for indeed even Inquisitors had succumbed to the lures of heresy in the past. Gabriel reminded Armoros of his legion's long and loyal service to the Imperium, of how the lion had fought without pause or respite during the heresy, expecting no reward for his loyalty as the galaxy burned. Still, they must all remain vigilant, which was the core of the message the Conclave had tasked him with delivering to the First Legion. And, of course, he added, the Inquisition didn't believe Obadiah's mad story was true. But even if it were, it would not mean the loyal Dark Angels should be punished for it. There were precedents for this sort of things, and a legion couldn't be blamed for the actions of a small group, else the entire legion's Astaroths would have been purged after the heresy. Armoros wasn't completely reassured. Centuries of imagining worst-case scenarios couldn't be so easily dismissed. But the panic that had dawned on him when the Inquisitor had first spoken settled. He did not reveal the truth of Caliban's fate to Gabriel, but as he led him back to his gunship and the transport left the rock to return to the Penitent's Blade, the Supreme Grand Master began to consider that perhaps his legion should reconsider their position on secrecy, once they made sure that Henodefer's position was sincere and shared by enough members of his organization. Then a phase blade buried itself through his back, piercing through his two hearts and bursting out of his chest. He died just as his mind recognized the weapon as a favorite of the Collegius Temple of the Officio Assassinorum, and his final thought was that he had been deceived. His body was found moments later, and before the Penitent's Blade could activate its warp engine, it was shot to pieces by the rock's vengeful guns, the Dark Angels convinced that the Inquisition had just murdered their Legion Master. Armoros had made sure that his meeting with Gabriel was listened on by a handful of his trusted officers, all members of the inner circle, who now believed that the day they had all feared had finally come. The first shots of the Unforgiven War had been fired. Meanwhile, on the rock, a pale creature known only as the Blade of Ptish hid within a gunship sent to investigate the wreckage of the Penitent's Blade, killing everyone aboard and taking the craft to a small vessel hidden in the system years ago. Its engines, designed and assembled in the Forge of Souls itself, ignited, and the ship vanished, taking its solitary occupant back to the servants of its employer, whose brand burned upon its alien skin, compelling service in return for continued life and protection from she who thirsts. The second phase of Horus' plan was complete, but the trials of the First Legion were far from over. Chapter 38, The Unforgiven War. Malium Datum, 594.m34. With the death of Inquisitor Henodefer and Supreme Grand Master Armoros, both the Inquisition and the Dark Angels believed the other responsible for the murder of one of their own. The Penitent's Blade had been able to transmit one last scrambled astropathic message before being destroyed, warning the Imperium of the Dark Angels' actions, and Horus' influence, and the Dark Gods too, who watched it all unfold with amused smiles, made sure that message reached as many ears as possible, remaining perfectly clear. The First Legion had opened fire on an inquisitorial vessel, had killed everyone aboard, including an inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus. Rumors spread about what had happened at Pandora, that the inquisitor had come to the Rock to demand answers about a renegade son of the Lion, who had spoken of betrayal across the entire legion before perishing. Rumors dating back to the proclamation swelled, speaking of the fallen who had fought alongside Horus armies in his Black Crusade. And around that core of truth, Horisian agents promptly spun their webs of lies. The Dark Angels were traitors, they whispered. They had harbored Horisian sympathies since the heresy, and when their loyal Primarch had fallen they had given in to those tendencies, serving as the War Master's warriors from the inside of the Imperium. And now that the Inquisition had found out, they were revealing their true colors, determined to bring the whole Imperium down. Kill teams of Vortigern's fallen that had waited in hiding for years were activated. They emerged from stasis crypts or secret strongholds, and launched raids against symbols of imperial authority. Judges and governors, administratum adepts, and nobles, all of them despised by the people around them, they were hunted down and slain in broad daylight by warriors bearing the iconography of the First Legion alongside the Eye of Horus. On 100 worlds, each resting at the center of a web of astropathic and trade channels, the fallen slew imperial tyrants in the War Master's name. Revolutions began as populations rose up in rebellion against the Imperium's oppression, championed by transhuman warriors in the colors of the Lion's Sons. As news spread of these attacks, the loyalist Dark Angel chapters engaged in war zonies across the Imperium found themselves under suspicion of treachery by their Imperial allies. Horisian agents, as well as paranoid Imperial commanders, ordered the arrest of the First Legion's warriors pending investigation. In a small handful of cases, the Dark Angels surrendered peacefully into the custody of the Imperial authorities, but in most cases, the paranoia that the hunt for the fallen had embedded into the Dark Angels' leadership made them fight back. Thus took place the Unforgiven War, as thousands of Dark Angels across the Imperium fought their erstwhile allies. Even other Space Marine legions were drawn into the conflict on both sides, though the distrust of the First Legion for outsiders and the extent of Horus' campaign of disinformation meant that most attempted to bring the Sons of the Lion to account. On the Rock, the officers who had taken over in the wake of the Legion Master's death sent out astropathic messages ordering the return of all Dark Angels to the Fortress Monastery, so that they could deal with this unprecedented crisis as a unified force. Obeying these orders, which came with the higher seals of authority and priority, whole companies of Astaroths who had yet to be affected by Horus' grand design suddenly withdrew from their battles against Xenos and heretics, abandoning their allies and further damaging the Legion's reputation. Others were forced to fight through Imperial forces in order to evacuate back to their ships. In one particular instance, only the intervention of the mysterious fallen known only as Cypher prevented the warriors of the 12th chapter of the First Legion from destroying an entire hive city in order to extract, with Cypher instead leading the trapped Dark Angels through a secret passage in the Underhive leading them outside where their gunships could pick them up. Cypher himself had disappeared by the time the Dark Angels emerged, but the slaughter of billions of Imperial citizens had been averted. Some Dark Angels simply vanished, looking upon the Imperial blood on their hands and unable to reconcile what they had done with their oaths. They became renegades, their minds breaking under the strain and choosing to reject all of their previous loyalty, blaming their own betrayal on the Imperium's treatment of them. In the worst cases, entire companies turned their coats, becoming roaming warbands that fought for nothing more than survival and bitter revenge against the empire that had failed them. Still, the vast majority of Dark Angels sought to reach the Rock, hoping that there would be answers waiting for them there. Their journey was far from tranquil. Decades ago, Night Lords packs had slipped out of the Eye of Terror using rituals performed by their terrified worshippers, and assembled flotillas of pirates and renegades that were now unleashed upon the Dark Angels. In revenge for the humiliation of the Thrumas Crusade, the Sons of the Night Haunter hunted those of the Lion with cruel glee, taunting them with how quickly the Imperium had turned on them and further poisoning their minds with doubt. Among the First Legion, only the inner circle had known the truth of the fallen, and though discipline held, no amount of preaching by the chaplains could keep the Battle Brothers from wondering just what had been kept from them, and for what purpose. The Rock itself left on a course for deep space, hoping to hide from Imperial eyes until a course of action could be decided. The First Legion had established a number of fallback positions across the galaxy, hidden bases empty of all life save a few maintenance servitors, where they could regroup in the case of disaster. Once the orders to regroup there had been sent using codes known only to the Dark Angels, the Rock ignited its warp engines to begin its own journey. But as the fortress monastery entered the warp, it was beset by furious storms, summoned into existence by the Prince of the Eye's pet sorcerers. For months, the Dark Angels were forced to fight off demonic incursions, battling Neverborn inside the corridors of their hallowed stronghold and firing anti-ship guns at inconceivably vast monstrosities pressing against the flickering Geller fields. When the Tech Marines finally managed to force a return to real space, it brought them to the ruins of the Caliban system, returned to the site of the Legion's great shame by the machinations of the archenemy. Attempts to depart immediately from this ill-omened system failed, for the great engines of the Rock had been badly damaged, with the Tech Marines estimating that the repairs would take months before the Rock could travel once more, and decades before the last of the damage was undone. The Lords of the Dark Angels quickly realized that their arrival in this particular system was a sign, but couldn't agree on its significance. Some saw it as a trap of the Dark Gods, but others thought it a sign of the Lion, who would soon return to judge them for their failures in the very place where the Legion's fate had once been decided. In any case, it was all meaningless debate so long as they were trapped here. Even as ships of the Legion began to arrive, drawn by new messages from the few astropaths who had survived the journey, abandoning the Rock was unthinkable. Beyond the strategic considerations, the prisoners who dwelt within its extensive network of cells couldn't be moved without revealing yet more secrets of the Legion to its warriors. The arriving Dark Angels demanded answers from their superiors, all of them having heard the heretical claims of the renegade Obadiah Hraken and the accusations of rampant murder and rebellion thrown by imperial authorities. Attempts by the Inner Circle to stamp down the revelations were met with dismal failure, as some of the warriors even dared to openly accuse their superiors of being renegades in disguise, manipulating the First Legion from the shadows for their own nefarious ends. Once again, millennia of secrecy worked against the Dark Angels, as the Battle Brothers felt torn between their oaths to the Legion and those to the Imperium and the Emperor. In the end, the Inner Circle decided to induct every Dark Angel into its ranks, revealing the truth of what had happened to Caliban to all the warriors of the First as soon as they arrived. But thousands of years of deceit could not be so easily erased, and blaming the Fallen for the attacks which had already happened sounded hollow to chapters who had themselves been forced to spill Imperial blood to defend themselves and reach the Rock. To make matters worse, new transmissions reached the Voxnet of the Dark Angels, piercing right through the layers of encryption and security. From within the asteroid field that made up Caliban's ruin, Vortigern, lieutenant of Horus and leader of the Fallen in the Eye of Terror, spoke to his estranged brothers. Vortigern claimed that the leaders of the Dark Angels were lying to the rest of the Legion. He pretended that he and those who had stood on Caliban had always been loyal to the Lion, that they had spent the heresy defending and fortifying the home world. But when the Primarch had returned, his advisors, unwilling to give up their power over the First Legion to the Calibanites, who, after the catastrophic losses sustained in the heresy, outnumbered them, had convinced him that they had betrayed him. To give his accusations more credibility, Vortigern told the Dark Angels to ask their leaders just what, and who, was kept imprisoned deep within the Rock, implying that Lionel Johnson himself might slumber there, trapped by the cabal that had betrayed him to ensure that he never woke and retook the reins of the Legion from them. Just like they had imprisoned all those who had stood against their plot on Caliban, subjecting them to unspeakable torments in order to break their minds, all in order to protect their lies and convince their own blind followers of their truth, like witch hunters of old torturing innocent to extract confessions in order to justify their own atrocities. Strife spread across the Dark Angels, but did not yet degenerate into open battle. The interrogator chaplains revealed the presence of the fallen captives, held in cells until they repented of their sins, only for some of their loyalist brethren to decry the entire effort as foolish, a waste of resources and lives even if the proclaimed goal was true. It was then, as confusion reigned and the Sons of the Lion were on the verge of drawing their swords, that the warp ripped asunder, and an imperial fleet emerged. The Inquisition had not taken Henodefer's death lightly, and had mustered a crusade force to bring the Dark Angels to account. A force capable of destroying a legion couldn't be assembled so quickly, but then the Dark Angels were far from having gathered their full strength either. Scores of ships of the Imperial Navy, led by the sinister vessels of the Holy Ordos and accompanied by all manners of warp-capable crafts from the systems that had been hit by the Fallen. The Space Marines of the other legions were present in force as well, with the Space Wolves, who had become the Inquisition's monster hunters after Rust's disappearance and held old grudges and older rivalries against the Dark Angels, being the first among them. Through arcane means, they had tracked the spoor of the First Legion to this place, the ruins of their fallen home world. The Lord Inquisitors leading the Armada ordered the Dark Angels to power down their weapons, shields and engines, and submit to questioning and punishment. The Dark Angels refused, blaming the Inquisition for the murder of their Supreme Grand Master and accusing them of wanting to purge the entire First Legion. Discussions swiftly turned to threats that would soon escalate into full-blown civil war if nothing changed. The cooler heads who attempted to defuse the situation were shouted down, and in more than a few cases executed on suspicion of treason on the spot. How many were killed by Horasian agents, and how many by loyal Imperial officers, would never be known for certain. Among the Dark Angels, some were ready to open fire on their own, believing that to open fire on the Imperial fleet was to be forever damned. Meanwhile, Vortigern continued to speak, despite the best efforts of the First Legion commanders to shut him out of their system. The Blade of Ptish had done its work well, and the gifts it had left behind ensured the fallen couldn't be silenced. Battle seemed inevitable, with both sides driven to hysterical paranoia by the plots of Horus Lupercal. But before the first shots of the Unforgiven War's final battle could be fired and the doom of the First Legion written in Imperial blood, a new ship entered the Caliban system. This ship arrived alone and unheralded, but her size dwarfed all but the rock itself. She was black as the void, and her name was written in silver letters upon her hull, each the size of a warhound titan, as it was broadcast for all to hear, along with her master's proclamation. She was the shadow of the Emperor, Gloriana-class flagship of the 19th Legion, reclaimed from the ruins of the Istvan massacre in the wake of the Scouring and rebuilt over the course of centuries of work. And on her command deck stood Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Raven Guard, who had come to prevent those who claimed to serve his father from doing the arch-traitor's work in his place. Chapter 39, The Second Fall of Caliban. Malium Datum, 594.m34. For centuries, the Raven Guard had been invisible. In the carnage of Istvan V, the 19th Legion had been all but annihilated. By the time of the Scouring, barely a few hundred sons of Corax had yet drawn breath across the entire galaxy. The Ravenlord's attempts to rebuild his legion's numbers using genetic technology gifted by the Emperor had failed catastrophically, sabotage by the Alpha Legion causing the new Raven Guards to be transformed into deformed monsters, the Wergeld, who had fought and bled against Horus traitors despite their affliction. After the traitors had escaped within the Eye of Terror and their taint burned from the galaxy, Corax had returned to his legion's home world of deliverance. There, the Primarch of the Raven Guard had considered the state of the galaxy and the Imperium. He knew that Horus still lived, and would one day return. The arch-traitor had proven his cunning when his plans had nearly destroyed the Imperium, and with all the time to plot in the Eye, there was no telling what new and terrible schemes he would weave. Humanity needed a secret weapon of its own, realized Corax. All of the Space Marine legions had their own talents, their own specialties, but the needs of the Great Crusade had forced them all to behave and fight in certain ways. This could no longer be the case, for in order to survive they must all become their greatest selves. And so, Corvus Corax decided that he and his sons would forsake glory, forsake recognition for their deeds, and become the shadows they had long walked amidst. The 19th Legion was forgotten. The will of Corax spread across the warp, and though the Raven Guard's existence did not vanish from records, people simply stopped thinking about it. Only those possessed of the strongest of wills were immune to this, and even then not always. Even the traitors in the Eye of Terror forgot about the Raven Guard, thinking them broken by the heresy when they thought of them at all. This was all exactly as Corax had wanted it. Slowly, he rebuilt his legion, moving in the shadows of the Imperium and recruiting young men in whose heart beat the desire to punish evil and protect the weak. New generations of Raven Guards rose from the Ravenlord's blood, unaffected by the mutations that had doomed the surviving Wergeld to such a painful existence that Corax had granted them mercy with his own hands at the Scouring's end. The Raven Guards became the unseen watchers and protectors of Segmentum Tempestus, kept in armor and ammunition by the forges of Kievar, over which Corax's rule was total. The pretense of independence the Tech Lords had once enjoyed ruthlessly erased and all protests of the local Mechanikus silenced. For thousands of years, the Raven Guard watched and fought, battling Xenos raiders and cults of chaos, their deeds unrecorded save for their own archives on Deliverance. The Raven Guards cultivated their mastery of stealth and assassination strikes to unprecedented levels, with their librarians developing entire new psychic disciplines based on supporting these tactics. Now, however, the time had come for Corvus Corax to step into the light. The Raven Lord had received a vision from his brother Sanguinius, who was fighting against a race of monstrous, chaos-corrupted Xenos in Segmentum Obscurus. The great angel had learned of the Horician plot to destroy the First Legion, and had begged his brother to intervene before the Dark Angels were undone. Only a Primarch had the strength and authority to prevent the distrust seeded by the Arch-Traitor's agents from resulting in civil war, and with Guilliman fallen and Dorn needed on Cadia last the hordes of the Damned seized the opening his absence would provide, only Corax remained. For a moment, Corax had hesitated. Was it worth sacrificing his legion's veil of forgetfulness, for there was no way it would endure through such a direct intervention, in order to save the First Legion from an end largely brought about by its own actions? Corax had heard the reports of what was happening as the Unforgiven War dawned, and the behavior of the Lion's Sons hadn't impressed him. In the end, however, the prospect of another legion falling to chaos, for such was the inevitable doom of all who abandoned the Emperor's light, should they survive long enough, was impossible to accept. The consequences should Horus gain control of another legion, even one as broken as the first would surely be by the unfolding scheme, were too dire. And so the Raven Lord had come to Caliban, focusing his power to shroud his presence from the denizens of the warp, lest they warn his brother's slaves of his coming. Corax's mastery of the great psychic power innate to all of the Emperor's sons had grown leaps and bounds since the heresy, to the point that the dark gods themselves had begun to forget the existence of his legion. But when the shadow of the Emperor emerged in the Caliban system, that shroud was torn to pieces. All the way to Melum, Horus sensed the change and sat straight on his throne, suddenly struck by the realization that he had forgotten to take one of his brothers into account in all of his plans for the last 3,500 years. The Imperials gathered to bring the Dark Angels to account were similarly struck dumb by the reveal of Corax. Seizing the initiative, the Raven Lord declared himself in command of all loyal Imperial forces in the system, making it clear that any who refused his orders for the duration of the crisis would be branded as traitors and hunted down by the full force of his legion, regardless of their motives or justifications. By that point, the Dark Angels' commanders were so overwhelmed that they gratefully accepted the authority of a Primarch not their own. The arrival of the Primarch threw the plans of Horus into disarray, and Vortigern was forced to improvise. At his call, the pirate flotillas of the Night Lords that had harassed the Dark Angels emerged from the warp, while the ships of the Imperial Retribution Armada which had been sent by Horician infiltrators turned on their brethren. The Source Rouse Veil which had kept the fallen flagship with blade drawn from detection fell, revealing the battleship hidden amidst the ruins of Caliban, its engines powering up as it set course for the rock. The Second Battle of Caliban was a confused mess, where the loyalty of individual elements was put in question by faked transmissions and acts of sabotage on loyalist ships. As the Void battle raged, the Night Lords abandoned their slaves and boarded the rock, striking for the holding cells where the captured fallen were kept prisoner. Daemons that had survived the purges of the Dark Angels and hidden in forgotten corridors emerged to join the fight, and the fortress monastery of the First Legion once again echoed with the sounds of war. Aboard the Shadow of the Emperor, Corax sensed great energies gathering in the ruins of Caliban, even as the Horician vessel cut through the disorganized Imperial ships in its way. Making a quick decision, the Raven Lord sent a strike force of his legion's most elite warriors, sailing the void aboard gunships fitted with stealth systems from the dark age of technology. He trusted them to deal with whatever was happening amidst the ruins of Caliban. His own mission was to keep the Imperial forces from killing each other, and to strike at the head of the Horician presence in the system. The asteroid field that Caliban had become had been kept from dispersing by the lingering psychic energy of the calamity that had destroyed the planet. By decree of the First Legion, the entire system was forbidden to all Imperial citizens, regardless of their rank and power, with only the Dark Angels sending patrols there every decade to ensure nothing had changed. The last such inspection had taken place 8 years before Horus' plot had unfolded on Pandora, and as the Raven Guard transports neared the corpse of a world they saw that things had changed. Covens of witches in void suits led by chaos sorcerers stood on the larger asteroids, performing rituals of unknown purpose. Later, it would be understood that they were attempting to call upon the echoes of the Ouroboros power, that antediluvian warp abomination that had been imprisoned at the heart of Caliban for untold eons. Their goal was to call back the fallen who had been scattered across space and time by the uncontrolled warp energies, in order to reunite all the thousands of Luther's followers who had yet to return to reality. The Raven Guard descended upon the ritual sites at full speed. They targeted the sorcerers first, recognizing the heraldry of the Thousand Sons along with that of the Dark Angels and Sons of Horus. The rituals were not defenseless, of course. Legionnaires of the 1st and 16th Legion stood guard over the Psykers, sent by Horus to assist Vortigern in doing the War Master's bidding. The ensuing fight disrupted the precariously balanced energies of the ritual, and with a sound like the cracking of reality's underpinning mechanisms, all of Caliban's asteroid field vanished, swallowed by the Empyrean along with all those who had been fighting among it. Corax felt the sudden disappearance of his sons before their last Vox transmission reached him, and though he mourned their losses he would not let it distract him from his duty. By this time, the shadow of the Emperor was engaging the ad hoc Horusian fleet that had assembled around the rock. The Raven Lord led the attack on the with blade drawn, striking straight for the bridge. None of the fallen or their servants could stand against the might of the 19th Primarch, not when he had drawn the fullness of his power back to himself for the first time in millennia. Daemon hosts, possessed and sorcerers, all fell before him, and soon the shadow of the Raven Lord stretched over Vortigern, promising death for all the sins the fallen lord had committed against the Imperium he had once sworn to protect. Your brother will win. Last words of the Chaos Lord Vortigern to the Primarch Corvus Corax, allegedly. Though Vortigern fought well, there was only one way such a confrontation could end. The Horusian Lord was slain, and the with blade drawn was seized, its complement of dark magi not quite managing to completely purge its databanks before they were killed by the Asteroutes Corax had brought with him. The knowledge within the cogitators would be put to good use by the Raven Guard in the coming years, despite the Inquisition's insistence that it be given unto them and them alone. With the Horusian flagship captured, the rest of the traitor fleet broke off, retrieving their parties on the rock when possible before fleeing. In the confusion of the battle, many of the renegades managed to escape. The dungeons of the First Legion had been breached during the fighting on the rock, and some of the fallen held captive there had been released, before either being left behind as distractions or brought along as the Sons of Kurs made their escape. Though it took time, Corax eventually managed to force the Inquisition and the Dark Angels to make peace, though the First Legion would face the consequences, not of the initial treachery of the fallen, but of their concealment of their existence and the crimes they had committed in order to cover it up. For the first time since the end of the Great Crusade, a Space Marine Legion changed its name. No longer would the warriors of the First Legion be called the Dark Angels, instead, they would be the Angels Penitent, until such a time as they had expunged the stain on their honor brought about by their actions regarding the fallen. The independence of the Angels Penitent was also severely curtailed, with the entire Legion bound to a century-long oath of service to the Ordo Hereticus. The prisons of the Rock were emptied of the remaining fallen, who were given to the Inquisition for interrogation, followed by execution in most cases, though it would later be whispered that some of the fallen had been spared and turned into agents of the Holy Ordos, serving as special forces for the Inquisition and wearing gear without any trace of their former, or any, allegiance. Corax believed that, while they had come perilously close to disaster, calamity had been averted in the end. But as the shadow of the Emperor prepared to depart Caliban, the Raven Lord was visited by diminutive figures in hooded robes, who revealed to him one more secret of the First Legion, which had been known only to their Supreme Grand Master before his assassination. And with that secret, Corax realized that he had been too hasty in declaring victory. Cypher and Mariana stood side by side, watching over the stasis coffin. Within, Luther slept in his armor, laid to rest like some king of antiquity. They had rescued the Lord of the Fallen from the rock, working together to deny him to the agents of Horus who had sought to rescue him and turn him into a puppet of the War Master. Their reasons for doing so were very different, of course. Mariana believed Luther had the potential to replace Horus in her plans to bring about the union between the dark gods and humanity, and didn't want to risk him being slain by the Prince of the Aya's arrival. And Cypher, well, his motives were, and would remain, his own. It was enough that Luther was sealed away once more, in a more tranquil stasis than the pain-filled one the Dark Angels had forced upon him. The two arch-heretics left, sealing doors that could only be opened should the two of them return here together, as they had agreed when they had sealed their alliance. Chapter 40, The Prophet of Cogs. Malum Datum, 979.m34. Since the days of the heresy, Mars had been peaceful, if never quiet. The followers of Kulberhal had fled from Mars at the same time the traitor Astaroutes had run from Terra, knowing that they couldn't hold the Red Planet alone. Some had remained behind, either willingly or unable to secure transport off-world, and the resulting battles had been as violent and bitter as those which had been waged on the throne world itself. But in the end, Mars had been reclaimed, and the Adeptus Mechanicus had finally begun to rebuild over the ashes of its past glories. To prevent another schism, the authority of the Mechanicus on the Forge worlds was much greater than that of the Mechanicum had ever been. Religious doctrine had supplanted politics and technological prowess as a mean of competition, with elements that had formerly belonged to the fringe of the cult of Mars taking center stage in the wake of the heresy's unwelcome revelations as to the true nature of the universe. Innovation and scientific progress, once the cornerstones of the Martian ethos, were now regarded with suspicion, considered gateways to the corruption of the Dark Mechanicum. At the same time, the tech priests grew ever colder and more inhuman, embracing what they perceived to be the perfection of the machine over the human frailties they held responsible for the Horus heresy. Human life, which had always been regarded as secondary to the pursuit of knowledge, became utterly worthless in their eyes save for what use it could be put to. Though the priesthood of Mars became ever more repressive and secretive, struggling in part to hide just how much of its lore it had lost in the heresy, the spark of innovation couldn't be so easily suppressed, and those tech priests who possessed it often found themselves running afoul of their superiors in the Adeptus, who used their technology to run what was, in effect, the single most efficient oppressive and invasive regime in the history of mankind. Through the omnipresent noosphere and use of cogitators to supplement the human brain, it was a challenge to keep even one's innermost thoughts from being heard. Such was the environment in which rose the being who would only be known as the Prophet of Cogs. Born in the southern Martian hemisphere, the Prophet of Cogs resented the suppression of knowledge and innovation. They believed that the knowledge hoarded by the Archmagi should be shared freely, instead of being left to gather dust before fading away when the one who had jealously guarded it inevitably perished. Having witnessed the harsh life of the tech thralls and menial workers of the Mechanicus, whose lifespan were made pitifully small by their brutal working conditions, they judged that the way the Mechanicus ran things was not just cruel but also wasteful. To them, every life spent in the wastelands and the foundries might just be the one who would rediscover some lost piece of lore, or the one who held the line against the Xenos horrors that still plagued the galaxy. As they rose through the lower ranks thanks to their genius intellect and understanding of machines, they sought to better the lives of their subordinates, swiftly leading them to surpass the productivity of other groups. To the complete lack of surprise of the Prophet of Cogs, treating one's workforce decently resulted in them being far more effective than when they were kept on the precisely calculated verge of death by starvation, exhaustion, and exposure. Perhaps inevitably, this attracted the jealousy of the Prophet's peers and superiors. Accusations of techno-heresy and doctrinal deviance were thrown, and the Prophet was subjected to an invasive probe of their innermost thoughts, an experience which could be summed up as a violent mind rape. No trace of tech heresy were found, and their softer approach was considered quaint naivete that they would eventually grow out of. The Archmagi were mistaken on that count. The callousness with which they had been treated only soured the Prophet's view of the Mechanicus. They saw the hypocrisy and the ruthlessness of the organization to which their very life belonged, and it infuriated them. Technology and science could and should be humanity's sword and shield, not treated like arcane knowledge only a select few were worthy of wielding under a suffocating veil of religious manipulation. Things had to change, and the Prophet was determined that they would make that change happen. But reform, no matter how well-meaning, was not something easily accomplished, and in the Imperium of these days to even suggest it was necessary was to earn censure. For too long, the Imperium had kept watch against any infiltration by the servants of the Dark Gods and their sympathizers. For years, the Prophet of Cogs worked to rise through the hierarchy and attempted to spread their ideals further. Many of the lower-ranking techno-adepts were attracted by their idealism, but they were the only ones. The Archmagi refused to consider that their way of doing things might be wrong, and lashed out violently when pressed. Once again, the Prophet of Cogs was accused of techno-heresy and ordered to subject themselves to a mind probe. This time, however, The Prophet refused, knowing that the probability they wouldn't survive the dangerous procedure this time were unacceptably high, given how many of their superiors begrudged their success. Within an hour of their refusal being sent across the Noosphere, the first Skitarii Legion marched to arrest them and all their followers, and so strife came once more to the planet that bore the name of a long-forgotten god of war. The followers of the Prophet of Cogs rose up in defense of their respected leader, turning their tools into weapons. The Prophet themselves bent their intellect to conflict for the first time in their life, and proved as gifted in it as they had been to every other field they had tried their hand at. Soon, the entire Forge City was in their hands, and they began to prepare for the inevitable retribution the Mechanikus would send their way. One of the few advantages they had was that the Mechanikus didn't want the rest of the Imperium to notice rebellion was occurring on Holy Mars itself. As a result, they couldn't mobilize the Titan legions or the greatest of their war machins, lest the other Imperial factions vying for supremacy at the heart of the Emperor's domain take advantage. Instead, they mobilized more Skitarii legions, sending them toward the rebel forge through underground tunnels that avoided the rad-scoured winds of the surface, all while shipments of raw materials continued to be delivered from orbit, the crew of the Ring of Iron having no idea of the defiance taking place on the surface, so total was the Archmagi's control of information. Within the forge, production continued, and under the guidance of the Prophet of Cogs productivity soared higher than ever before. This allowed the rebel lord to continue their research and defiance while also fulfilling all the obligations of those they had overthrown. Perhaps some part of the Prophet of Cogs hoped that this would lead their superiors within the Mechanikus to reconsider their position, seeing the logic in embracing a new way if it was blatantly more efficient. If so, they were disappointed, for the leaders of the Adeptus Mechanicus were far too set in their ways and orthodoxy to consider the mere suggestion of reform as anything but heresy. Martyrdom wasn't what the Prophet of Cogs wanted, whether for themselves or their followers. With the Ring of Iron surrounding Mars, however, escaping the Red Planet seemed impossible. Alone, they might have succeeded, but they refused to abandon their followers. The Prophet's salvation came when the Archmechanicus Archimedes Legacy returned to Mars, having led an expedition in wilderness space for the last 4 centuries. Its commanding Archmagos, Gazirius Vinagles, had been out of contact with the Adeptus Mechanicus, and didn't know of the Prophet's defiance of the established order. Distrust toward someone who had spent so long away kept the Martian overlords from informing him, and the legacy anchored where it always had on the Ring of Iron, directly above the Prophet's forge, where it began to unload its cargo of plundered relics and accumulated data. The Archmechanicus held more than enough space for all the people who had joined the Prophet's peaceful rebellion against the dictates of the Archmagi, and the suggestion of seizing it and abandoning Mars to start again elsewhere soon gained traction among the Prophet's supporters. The exodus, however, would be noticed by the Archmagi, who were sure to react. The Prophet of Cogs wasn't sure what they'd do, but desperation may drive them to abandon all prudence and subtlety in order to keep the dissenters from escaping. Simulations of atomic fire and cover UPS blaming heretical elements flickered through the Prophet's cogitators, and they decided on a drastic course of action. A diversion was needed, something which would keep all eyes on Mars' surface long enough for the hundreds of thousands of menials and tech priests who followed them to reach orbit, capture Archimedes' legacy, and escape Sol. The Prophet had the means to accomplish such a diversion. They, too, had held back during the years of Cold War. Part of the reason why had been to avoid proving their opposition right, but ethical concerns had also held their hand from unleashing the most terrible results of their research free of the Mechanicus dogma. But no longer. The Prophet of Cogs would not sacrifice their people just to make a point, especially when the other side had proven unwilling to even entertain the possibility that they might be wrong. And so, 10 standard Martian days after the docking of the Archmechanicus, hordes of cybernetic horrors emerged from the Martian wastes. Since the days of the heresy, uncounted millions of abandoned war machines had lingered in the empty plains of the Red Planet, built by both sides of the terrible civil war that had sundered the Mechanicum. The Prophet of Cogs had designed a noospheric plague capable of overriding the shattered minds of the Forsaken constructs, while also being harmless against the Mechanicus' own augmented humans. As the Martian overlords panicked at the sight of the cyberghouls and scrambled to defend their forges against the hordes driven from hiding and at their walls, the Prophet made their move. They led their people up to the Ring of Iron in a great flock of ships, and boarded the Archimedes Legacy, subduing its crew with more of the secret weapons their leader had designed in their private laboratory. The situation on Mars had drawn the eyes of all of Sol by that point, and the Archmechanicus disengaging from the Ring of Iron didn't surprise anyone, especially when the Prophet of Cogs broadcast a message claiming they were withdrawing to avoid contamination by the Nospheric Plague. By the time the Martian Archmagi realized what had happened, the Legacy had reached the Mandeville Point, and vanished into the warp. Though they had escaped the Imperium, the Mechanicus dissidents were far from safe. Horus knew well how important the machine cult was to humanity, and had made many attempts to divide Mars and Terra. The Prophet's rebellion had nothing to do with the War Master's agents on Mars, but those agents had reported it to him. The Prince of the Eye saw an opportunity in the Prophet of Cogs, and believed that they could be of great use to his cause if properly approached and convinced of the righteousness of his rebellion against the Golden Throne. He would need to make contact as an ally, offering aid to survive and prosper in a hostile galaxy, and slowly influence the Prophet and their followers until they saw things as he did. It would be the work of decades, but Horus was confident he could do it. Half the Imperium had once broken its oaths to his father on his word, after all. Unfortunately for Horus, but fortunately for the galaxy, he wasn't the only one to notice the potential of the Prophet of Cogs. The daemons of Tzientch had their own ears in the Horusian dominion, and one Duke of Change decided to act in order to suborn the Prophet. The hope of beneficial change, the pursuit of true knowledge in service of humanity, those things that the Prophet of Cogs championed against the stagnation of the Mechanicus were irresistible to the greater daemon. It yearned to corrupt them, to twist the Prophet's dreams into nightmares of selfish ambition and unfettered madness. The Archimedes legacy came under attack in the warp, with the Duke of Change leading a demonic incursion. Its attempt to turn the Prophet of Cogs to Tzientch's service failed miserably, and instead ended with its banishment at the Prophet's own hands using a blessed Mechanicus power axe. For all their knowledge, the Prophet had never been witness to the true nature of the warp, having never even left Mars in their entire life, and the experience scarred them deeply, as it did all their followers. They knew now that daemons were both real and evil, and in a speech broadcast all across the Archmechanicus, the Prophet swore that they would forever stand against such corruption, without succumbing to the pitfalls that had beset the Adeptus Mechanicus. Eventually, the legacy dropped out of the warp, emerging in a lifeless system within Segmentum Pacificus. The dissidents had been dragged far off course by the warp storm the daemons had hurled at them, and the Archmechanicus was too damaged to risk another journey even if there hadn't been the threat of another demonic attack. Under the Prophet's guidance, they began the work to settle on the system's worlds, determined to overcome the challenges they faced and build the utopia they had been stopped from turning Mars into. When Horus learned of these events, he ordered his sorcerers to drag the Duke of Change responsible from the warp. The War Master's plan to slowly turn the Prophet to his cause was doomed now, as they would regard any approach by him or his agents with utmost suspicion. But he needed to know whether the Duke's failure had been just that, or if there was a deeper game being played by the Court of Change. And, of course, Horus also fully intended to vent his frustration on the hapless greater daemon of Tzientch. There were torments that even the Neverborn feared, and the Prince of the Eye intended to visit them all upon the creature which had ruined his plans. Check the description for the links to the author.